In complete darkness, the first bloody sparks flashed and swirled. Those who appeared became more and more numerous. That night, the huge estate was burned to ashes under the terrifying, relentless roar of the flames. In the whirl of hellish fire stood an exhausted young man, and his thoughts kept repeating. His whole life had turned into a complete failure. He seemed to be stuck in his own despair. He failed to stop his younger brothers from fleeing and could not save those who remained nearby. Suddenly, through the crackling flames, a dull thud of heavy footsteps sounded. From the smoke emerged a killer in a mask, his cold gaze fixed on the doomed eyes of the young man. He muttered a curse against the bloody cult through clenched teeth. The bitter truth finally crushed him. He could not stand firm and protect his home. The cultists simultaneously drew their swords and held them ready, intending to erase the Songamun clan from history forever. First a strike, then talks. Understood, the young man grimly smiled and tightly gripped the hilt of his weapon. Even if his combat skills were lacking, he was still Lee Hwi, the head of the clan, and in this fight he would hold himself with dignity. In the whirl of hellish flame, he tightly grips the sword and, sharply raising his voice, swears, at least he will take death where he himself decides. He rushed forward abruptly, cutting through the fiery curtain to crash directly into the killers in black. Letting out a furious scream, the warrior intercepted the blade and met it with a whole avalanche of enemy strikes. Fingers clenched the hilt to white knuckles, squeezing the pressure so it would not break free outside. Sparks were waking up in the darkness. Suddenly, a devastating flash of pink energy cuts through the space, and the protection instantly washes him away from the spot. Blood trickled down from him in streams, and he shook his head. How cursed his fate turned out to be, and all in vain, since he took on the clan's burden only because of the rank of senior apprentice. Despair wrapped his eyes in a veil. If only he had guessed that ahead awaited only regrets. Pitch darkness, and through it tiny air bubbles. With a dull splash, the body lost resistance and sank without a trace into the depths. Suddenly, underwater, frightened children's eyes opened with shock. She stared at the burning light right above her head. The surface rapidly grew before the eyes. With icy despair, he jerked himself out from under the water and greedily gulped air. Surfacing, he confusedly turned his head. As far as the eye could see, a wide river spread out. He was gripped by the silence of shock. He stubbornly remembered how the cultist's blade had just cut his body. Suddenly, through the noise, came the weak cry of his younger brother, and he immediately froze. Below, in the raging waves under the bridge, the child was struggling with all his might and reaching out desperately to the surface. It was Hohan, the boy whom their birth mother had once abandoned. The fourth younger apprentice, the one he had personally fed and raised while their teacher wandered the world. The memory hit him like a blow to the gut. The child's laughter of the little one who was fighting on his back, followed by a torn kite in the sky and a bitter feeling of guilt for never having been able to save him. He realized that his brother was still alive and immediately felt tears welling up in his eyes. With a tearing scream, he plunged straight into the swirling current. His hand burst forward through the thick water. A sharp splash sounded, and he finally gripped his brother firmly, squeezing him with no chance to slip away. Half-conscious, Hohan barely released air through his lips. Directly underwater, he emitted the last bubbles like a quiet exhale in response. They sank deeper under the water, and the body was already sharply seized by icy water and cold. Old pain broke the silence and rushed back into memory. Then the body stiffened like stone, and he could not save a close person. And now he sharply opened his eyes. Mighty blue energy embraced his hands. The man-mind technique, just mastered by him, was supposed to save his brother from death. He mentally gave the body an order to move forward with all his strength. Blue flashes of lightning cut through the water's thickness, and he pressed the child to himself with desperate force. The thin body had not yet gained strength, so the young man painfully closed his eyes from overload. The forced flow of power mercilessly cut the meridians from the inside. Suddenly, his body was instantly seized by a shock. Silence. He froze. Exhaustion receded. Internal energy surged upward, rapidly increasing strength with each passing second, multiplying many times over. He fixed his gaze on the pale face of the unconscious Hohan. "This time the older brother will pull you out," he said firmly, and the water vortex around them surged with new strength, raising a sharp explosion. The fist clenches with effort. A dry crunch is heard in the dazzling blue flash. A powerful impulse cut through the water's thickness and swiftly lifted them both from the very depths to the dazzling light of the surface. His senses sharply sharpened. He flawlessly read the river's current, caught every movement of a fish's fin, and noticed the slightest bubble rising nearby. His gaze flashed with blue rays, and his consciousness suddenly expanded to the limit. An echo rolled through his head. 1 is 10,000 and 10,000 make up the 1. The space surged and tore apart with a dazzling pillar of light. The sky cracked from the impact of the downpour, and fish, thrown by the water, poured onto the wet boards. A heavy step and it scares puddles with splashes. The young man made his way through the rain, step by step, barely holding the unconscious child on his shoulders. His strength finally left him. He helplessly sank to his knees, exhausted to the limit. His head spun relentlessly, and his hands, darkened by tension, barely held the weight of his own body. Due to forced circulation, the muscles twisted and turned under unbearable pain, and the body was completely exhausted. And through the pain that clenched his features, a faint smile barely appeared. He quietly pressed the boy to himself and sighed with relief. This time Hohen would get to live. There was only one thing left: to return home to his clan. Leaving only a crumb of strength inside, he again threw the child over his back and immediately started running. The white-haired man rushed with all his might to the sunlit yard, tightly pressing his burden to his chest. The soul touched the ground and sparked a flash. He instantly stopped right in front of the stone stairs. A brief pause of silence. Two children huddled from below, and the girl immediately called out loudly to her older brother, joy ringing in her voice. Her sincere sparkle in her eyes instantly faded as soon as she noticed his gray hair. Seeing this, the boy next to him suddenly turned pale and shocked, barely whispered, "Tangulia." The young man, on the other hand, drank in their faces with his gaze and held a warm smile on his lips, barely holding back tears of relief. The little girl almost burst into tears from panic. She was asking what had happened to both of them, and what had happened to Keva. Watching them closely, he finally believed. A miracle had indeed happened, and he truly returned. He found himself in the past again. Late at night, sitting by the bed of the saved comrade, he gave himself an honest answer. At least once everyone dreamed of turning back time, and he was definitely no exception. His gaze suddenly darkened, gloomy thoughts thickened in it, and it looked dangerous. For a moment he silently stared into the void, and the shadow on his face grew darker and darker. He suddenly grabbed his head and froze in complete despair. Would he have to live through this hell again from the very beginning? An image of the teacher emerges from memory, a carefree man who could never cope with the clan's antics and was constantly wandering somewhere but treated the children kindly. His frivolity placed all the household burdens on his back, the helm of the fields and affairs in the shops, and even despite this, money was barely enough just for food. Moreover, the master tirelessly pulled more and more orphans from the streets. He twitched with nervous laughter, proudly calling themselves a clan, but in reality they ran an ordinary shelter for beggars. In the night silence, he sat by the bed of his sick younger brother. Finally, the fever subsided. Despite everything, this was a true clan founded by the swordsman Sanan Yu Hyunjun. In the district, he was revered as an outstanding warrior and recognized as the best blade master. Yet the teacher still could not pass on his skills to the students. The young man bitterly decided that the reason lay in his own incompetence. As soon as the second and third students received the title of masters, they turned around without a word and left, leaving the impoverished clan at the mercy of competitors while he himself worked tirelessly. But all this was done for only one reason in the end: fanatics from the bloody cult would stab him anyway. He grimly clenched his jaws and felt the bitter truth of his past catching up from within. The white-haired young man lay down on the floor, hands behind his head, and dryly declared aloud he would no longer allow himself to live like this. He bitterly admitted, before he only carried the duties of the senior student, the brother and head of the clan. His palms silently slid across the floor. He had no intention of repeating his own failed life. When the young man shifted his gaze to the sleeping boy with a bandaged head, softness appeared in his eyes. This time he decided everything here must go differently. In the semi-darkness of the room, Lee Hwi knelt before his teacher, who was stunned, and repeated what he had just heard. The student carefully pressed his forehead to the very floor. The master furrowed his brows and still could not believe what he had just heard. Lee Hwi sharply threw his head back and firmly declared, from now on he would live only as he himself wished. The teacher gloomily asked again what Lee Hwi had just managed to say. The student stubbornly stared into his interlocutor's eyes and firmly declared, henceforth he would live as he himself wished. A tense silence hung in the air, compressing the space. The teacher imagined Lee Hwi looking like a wild street hooligan, and this sent a sharp shiver through him. Yet the boy sat quietly and obediently before him on the floor. The teacher sighed painfully, breathing heavily. He rose from behind the table and loudly called the student to go for a walk. Lee Hwi blinked in confusion. The full moon hung over the estate, bathing it in cold light. They silently walked through the night courtyard, stepping evenly through the darkness. And instantly the teacher turned his head and threw a sharp remark into the auditorium. Lee Hwi is the gray-haired one standing aside, seems to be a mentor because he does everything as he pleases, and that's exactly why he turned gray so early. The boy's face seemed frozen in stone. And then in his head, from shock, a resonant mental scream flashed. His strict teacher just tried to joke. The teacher slowly ran his hand over his chin, thoughtfully holding his gaze. He moved forward and the blonde student froze, bewilderedly watching him with his eyes down his back. Suddenly, the expression on the man's face became gentler. He admitted, long ago he intended to thank, and it was precisely because of the boy Hohan that he managed to stay alive then. These words instantly pushed the youth back into the past to the black day of Hohan's death. The master practiced his farewell dance with the sword for 49 days continuously, without catching his breath under the moonlight. He did not shed a single tear, but the loss tore his heart like a knife through the living. "I know this fell on you because of my indifference," the teacher said quietly. "I am sincerely grateful to you." A warm, heavy palm covered the boy's head, and from that moment on he could live as he wished. In the man's gaze there was a paternal calm. The apprentice froze in shock. He had gained the dreamed-of freedom too easily, but it was then that the master asked him what he would do next. A dull, short pause hung in the night yard. The young man awkwardly ran his fingers over the back of his head and quietly exhaled, admitting that he had no idea what to do next. The teacher barely leaned forward, gave a soft smile, and quietly confessed that this boy was his first apprentice. The youth's eyes suddenly widened, as if struck unexpectedly. He tightly clasped the clothes on his chest with his hands, drinking in the mentor's promise to always stand by and be on his side. The gaze was shaken by a tremor. A blush flared on his cheeks. The boy had no idea that the teacher had held him in special esteem all his life, and because of this, his heart pounded wildly in his chest. Suddenly the vision broke off. The youth jerked his whole body and, gasping, fidgeted amid the sparkling energy around. In the moonlight, the man said briefly and dryly, "It's already late," and the apprentice froze confusedly, staring at his own palm. The teacher sharply turned and gave the order, "Move back." But still, stepping back a step, he barely smiled kindly at his own thoughts about that boy. The frame broke, and before his eyes appeared a dreadful village, ravaged by plague. Among the skeletons and the rustling flock of crows sat an exhausted child, her eyes frozen empty, without any reflection. From the darkness, a hand barely stretched out. The boy remained the only one who survived, and now was slowly fading from hunger. The man froze in the very center of the night cemetery and, without blinking, examined the exhausted child lying among human bones. It turned out Zenata looked, and before him stood his peer, a man of the same age as his, a son who had long since died. The master sharply lowered his gaze. Leaving the child without support was more than he could bear. A large hand stretched forward and touched the tormented baby. Years passed. The apprentice grew up quiet and obedient, but the man remained cold, without warmth and without attention. He did not even notice how the boy grew up, so now he stubbornly decided to be a true father-mentor to him. A warm smile slid across his face as soon as he glanced at the courtyard bathed in light and assured himself in his thoughts, "This is his home." The school is drowning in the quiet light of the full moon. Entering the corridor where a creepy, bloody aura was already spreading, he finally realized where he really needed to go. From the darkness, red demonic hands reached out to him, and the past could no longer be erased. He firmly took a step forward. The master shakes the hand, and from that moment he becomes an unwavering support for his students. The man, with a barely noticeable smile, pondered over what these children would grow up to be. Suddenly his gaze became sharper, as if a blade had been honed. The air suddenly shuddered, and the warrior automatically tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword. In the distance, a powerful whirlwind of energy rose. It pulsed like a living, rhythmic breath. KHVI stood straight in the very center of this storm. Everything started again from scratch. The young man froze in place with his eyes tightly shut and allowed the elements to take him without resistance. Massive water flows rampaged through the yard, sometimes warm, sometimes icy, thick and incredibly heavy, as if moving as a solid body. These two opposing energies merged in a wild whirlwind and began to bite directly into his body. HWI gathered all his power into a shining blue sphere, which he held right in front of his chest. As soon as he greedily absorbed the energy, it suddenly cut off and rolled away like a sea ebb that pulls the water back. Usually the inner strength first settles in the Danshan and only then spreads through the meridians, gathering the small and large heavenly orbits. But his agitated body brazenly rejected all these classic stages, as if they did not exist at all. The flow of power covered the body and just as suddenly melted away, leaving a clear sensation. Before him acted a different way of thinking, Manhwa. But as soon as this flashed through his thoughts, the guess ignited itself. This is also the right path, where the one holds 10,000 within itself, and 10,000 merging become one. A dazzling flash toward the silence of space. He suddenly realized it was the immersion in the river that pushed the subconscious to retrieve the true mantra from memory. With a poisonous, shaky thought in his head, he fell without resistance to the very bottom. A gigantic whirl of blue energy snatched his body from the spot and pulled it along. The boy froze motionless before the incredible glow, as if he were spellbound. In the rays of light, a familiar male silhouette suddenly appeared. He was gripping a sword. He stunnedly scanned the familiar yard, the native walls, flower beds, and every tree in the garden, as if recognizing them by their marks. It was Sangmun. The dearest faces from the past flashed before his eyes in memory. The house where he earned the title of senior student, where he lived his entire life from the first to the last day, and where he found his end. He smiled faintly. He dived into his own depths, where love strangely intertwined with hatred. Resentment, guilt, suffocating tension, and forced calm merged into one furious stream. This manifestation emphasized for him the absolute unity in everything that existed in Sangmun. A dazzling flash tore open the space and revealed the final revelation. The One contains everything, and everything is enclosed in the One. The young man twitched instantly and turned sharply around. Pillars of bright energy crashed down from above and instantly covered his figure, completely destroying the silhouette in the glow. He felt the power run through his body like a wave, and with relief exhaled, confident that he had finally grasped the very essence. From the long-awaited relief, her lips spread into a smile, and at that very moment, somewhere inside, a dull and sharp crack sounded. The boy, frightened, sharply lowered his gaze, and right where his spiritual center should have been, a black hole was swelling. An invisible impulse cut through his energy shield and shook the space around like fragile glass about to crack. Losing balance, he fell into complete darkness and feverishly pressed his trembling hands to his stomach. The brain stubbornly could not accept what had happened. The Danshin had completely disappeared, leaving no trace. This deep mystical experience turned out to be the end for him. He himself, with his own hands, erased from the world his only source of power. "Congratulations," Li Hwi mockingly responded in his head, while cold sweat of despair was already rolling down his temple. The tall warrior in a black cloak stood in front of the boy and suddenly greeted him. With a barely noticeable smile, he agreed. The young man had finally found his path, and then asked what exactly he had seen inside man. The master stared at him with a gaze warm, focused, and slightly squinting. The boy was suddenly confused and froze in place, not understanding what exactly he had just opened. The young man, in panic, only managed to realize that his Danshin had disappeared when the mentor immediately said, "The divine art of man has 10,000 interpretations." He raised his hand and drew a bright blue line in the air, shining right before him. In a moment, the mentor lunged sharply. The energy blade flew so close that it almost cut the student in half. The sudden burst of power jerked the ribbon in the young man's hair with a sharp tug. The shining blade froze in the air while the man remained unshaken and continued to say, "Everyone must find their own path." The fate of manhood depended on a single decision. It could ignite as a divine gift or turn into the most terrifying demonic art. The master, noticeably relieved, immediately placed his palm on the boy's head. The tension vanished instantly. He gently ran his hand through his hair, shining with sincere relief. The child would not have to repeat his hard fate. This man was not only a teacher, a truly outstanding fighter, and in the entire Anson County, no one matched him. He ran his fingers confusedly over his forehead, not understanding why the mentor was so brightly pleased with their difference in paths. The gaze freezes. The boy suddenly realizes that he has no idea about his master. After an exhausting day, he calmly passed the task inside, and the apprentice obediently bowed without objection. He stared for a long time at the back of the man, who was dissolving into the darkness of the yard. Earlier, he constantly complained about how little they give in lessons, but now he finally understood. One contains 10,000, and those 10,000 are also one. The master's footsteps quickly receded backward, moving farther and farther away. Staring intently at the night estate, he accepted his task. A bird will never teach a chick stuck in the shell to fly. But the ghost of the teacher's power still did not let the boy go. He still could not piece together what exactly he saw today. He froze in place, motionless. Faces of the closest people flashed before his eyes, and each frame again pressed on the main question: what is the true essence of his own manhood? Night darkness spread over the roof like a burden hanging overhead. Drained to the edge, the boy dragged himself heavily, stopping at every step through the empty corridor. Reaching for the heavy frame, he sighed exhaustedly, and the only thing he dreamed of was that someone would open these doors for him. The young man pressed his palm against the massive bookshelf, and it clicked dully, working. He lost his train of thought and froze, not understanding what was happening. The lock clicked, the boy twitched the corner of his lips in a nervous smile and immediately understood. Ordinary words would not budge the door. A resonant clink of metal, the lock's latch abruptly unlocked and cut through the silence. The heavy doors slowly slid aside by themselves. The young man sharply lowered his gaze to his own palm. Shock sharply stretched his face. Could it be that he had just used telekinesis? This absolute technique allowed the highest masters to control flying swords. And now, by the effort of his own mental power, he was able to lift only a kitchen ladle from the floor. The cracked wooden handle sliced through the air. The ladle fit perfectly in his palm, and the boy himself did not understand where this skill had suddenly come from. He unhurriedly turned back to the boiling cauldron. The young man stirred the brew and cast a sidelong, ironic smile. He only had enough strength to handle the cooking utensils. But after throwing a log into the fire, his mood did not waver at all. What he wanted most was not great battles, but a quiet, carefree life. The new morning unfolded with usual chores. In the stove, a roaring flame stirred with a sharp rumble. The young man suddenly froze, letting streams of hot energy flow inside him. His dantian was destroyed, but the power of Manhwa martial art now freely spread throughout his body, paving the way to every muscle. He slowly stirred the boiling water in the cauldron. Cleaning the yard and carrying water, now every household routine continuously replenished his strength. For martial arts masters, this was sheer futility, but such work suited him perfectly. The lad wiped sweat from his forehead and laughed at his own endurance, but suddenly it struck him like thunder. He had once again polished the entire house to a shine on autopilot. The boy clutched his head in despair. Decades of exhausting labor had imprinted into his very subconscious. A thin child's voice cut through the panic, and the boy, swallowing his discomfort, sharply turned around, suddenly remembering Hohen, who was already hungry. From behind the doorframe, a toddler cautiously peeked out, as if afraid to make an extra move. The brother whispered and dared to ask about food, and the young man gently led him by the hand straight to the table, where everything was already served. Hohen even blinked in delight and immediately blurted out. He caused a warm smile in the elder. With joyful laughter, he swiftly dashed across the sunny courtyard. Watching him with his eyes, the boy only slightly closed his eyelids. He was clearly glad for the temporary calm. The sunlit estate radiated silence and tranquility, so he postponed thoughts about his own future to a later time. The teacher and students gathered around the round table. His gaze slid over the mentor, and suddenly he was enlightened. In their past life, they almost never sat together for a meal. A sincere smile flashed on his lips. The old man was truly happy because little Hohen survived. He extended the chopsticks. Nearby, the boy snorted angrily, puffed his cheeks, and could not manage the lunch. With a sharp gesture, he threw the food high into the air and immediately asked who would get this portion. Out of delight, Hohen even gaped, and the elder brother immediately rumbled with his voice demanding his piece. The little one joyfully reached forward towards the moment. The treat hit right on target. The boy chewed contentedly, sparks of happiness flying from his mouth, while the other two stood blinking in confusion. A carefree moment stretches without any worries. He quietly stretched his lips into a smile and honestly admitted to himself, all this noisy fuss is actually just convenient. An ordinary bean shot up into the sky with a whistle. The little one eagerly moved closer and sharply poked it with his finger, surprised at why anyone would waste telekinesis on such trifles. His face blossomed with joy, and he lit up with happiness. The older man silently propped his chin with his palm and watched the game intently. The children burst into laughter and noise, trying to imitate the magical hand movements. The girl listened to her own state. The more she resorted to power, the more energy she gained. Suddenly, the bean sprouted miniature legs and, dancing amusingly, twirled above the plates. The little one laughed loudly. Everyone leaned over the table in fascination. She smiled softly and kindly, lingering for a moment longer to fully savor this peaceful moment. But suddenly, the elder broke this idyll with a sharp movement. In 15 days, the main sect will gather everyone. Control momentarily collapsed, and Bob collapsed without resistance straight into the food. A confused silence hung over the table, as if no one dared to move. "Did you say gathering?" he asked again, and surprise finally struck him. His eyes sharply widened in astonishment. Even before the Sun Ui Master Gate appeared, Anson arrived in the air, bringing with him a confused little one. In the city, power was ironclad, held by 4 martial arts schools. The Oso sect is led by a huge leader who wears a broad smile on his face. The humble Changhian family and the Down faction. The last had always hid his cunning gaze behind a fan. And of course the battered Chagan gang. In Anson, just as the Sun Ui Gate appeared, these 4 schools approached the master with a proposal to form a peaceful alliance of 5 sects. They all sat silently and did not dare to step against the master, the most powerful warrior of all Anson. Meeting, the young man twitched all over as soon as he realized he had not heard this word for many years. After the master's death, this tradition was broken, and as soon as the darkness lifted, greedy hands reached for it. Only he was feared by the enemies, so without a leader, the gate sharply declined and quickly sank to the bottom. In this chaos, it was the Chagan gang that broke through to the top. They swiftly seized the former influence of Sun Ui, capturing the city with wild terror. In the distance rose a massive dark fortress. Its power had already erased from the face of the earth or swallowed 3 other schools. The young man least of all wanted to get involved with the Chagan gang. In his past life, they had exhausted him the most when he had to lead the school without the master's protection. His hand clenches into a fist with force. He had carried this enmity within himself long before this. In his memory, the silhouette of Guak Ch Hall Yu ominously surfaced. The young man exhaled heavily, as if suppressing anxiety. This time everything will be different. He had already pulled Ho Chan out of trouble. Under the watchful eye of the little one nearby, he reluctantly admitted, the events of the past are unlikely to repeat word for word. The boy suddenly rejoiced and jumped forward, impatiently begging his older brother, show that trick again. The young man with a restrained smile spun the toy on the string in the air. His gaze slid over his people at the dinner table, and in his thoughts he begged only one thing, let it go without disaster. The day has come when everyone must gather. The hall was bustling with fuss. It was necessary to urgently recruit a whole bunch of helpers from neighboring shops and visiting courtyards. The final preparations were sweeping over like a wave and continuing at a non-stop pace. The master again pulled silver out of nowhere. Although the school was barely making ends meet, the huge sums for hosting guests were released not for show and not to throw dust in the eyes. The master stood in the very center of the room, hands behind his back, and in a steady tone said that everything was coming together perfectly. The apprentice silently exhaled from deep in his chest. No matter how much that collection forced the factions to pay debts to the city, his school still had nothing to give away. The mentor smiled gently and proclaimed that this is the only day when the poor and travelers can rest and have fun without worries. The young man suddenly realized the silent tradition the master carried on his shoulders for years was not for himself, it was all for these people. Under the cauldrons, the flame roared wildly, raising thick clouds of hot steam upwards. He confidently winked, acknowledging all this had really grown into a true big celebration. Nearby, everything was already boiling. The little one energetically waved his hands and, excitedly addressing the guests, passionately explained in words how the older brother had pulled him out of the river in one swift move. The adults burst out with genuine, sincere laughter. The boy amusingly showed how imaginary waves raged, and the guests with good-natured smiles teased the little warrior and demanded, "Tell us more." While this was going on, near the very gates another boy was focused and politely showing the way to new visitors. The guests smiled touchedly, not hiding their amazement at the boy's mature restraint and refined manners. While everything continued, the little one darted like a whirlwind to wherever his desire suddenly pointed, lightly stomping with bare heels. The older brother sharply looked back. Just behind his back, a little girl had just scaredly crouched. The women around blossomed with warm smiles, looking at the little girl with tenderness. But she blushed deeply and instantly hid behind the young man's back. He gently ran his palm through her hair, savoring every moment. He knew she had not yet learned to accept such closeness. After parting from her relatives, the girl hardly felt any affection until his own thoughts were interrupted by a loud voice announcing the arrival. An unknown man with a confident appearance headed straight for the heavy gates. Heavy footsteps echoed dully and drawn out, bouncing off the stone slabs. In the square, their company was already waiting until the elderly leader in front burst out laughing loudly. It turned out they had come early. He jokingly complained that he could not wait. A stocky, mustached man stepped forward to meet them. Guak Sahu, leader of the Chagan gang, nicknamed the Wolf Axe. The elder greeted him evenly and calmly, but as soon as this gang appeared in the air, the tension immediately thickened. Guak saw who threw back a feigned friendly smile beneath it hid a narcissistic and greedy predator and said he had not come alone, he had brought his son with him. The boy standing nearby greeted politely and reservedly, showing the appearance of someone who came to learn from experience. Behind, a youthful figure ground his teeth fiercely, remembered perfectly. After the master's death, this very man mercilessly trampled her home. A cold gaze struck the interlocutor, and he firmly declared, the true curse of their bond is hidden not there at all. In memory flashed the silhouette of the one who once smashed the Sun Ui gate to pieces and drove the enemy so hard that he miserably sprawled in the mud. The stranger self-satisfiedly crossed himself with a smile and loudly introduced himself, Guak Ch Hall Yu, the junior leader of the Chagan gang. Nearby, a crowded banquet was bustling, and the noise rolled around like a wave. He looked confusedly, watching how the guest leisurely dealt with the food. In his past life, this man had brushed off every gathering. The mosaic came together. Instead of a funeral, nothing. The meeting had already taken place earlier, so now the living little Ho Hien happily pulls him by the sleeve. He smiled radiantly and calmly asked the child, "Today, manage the lunch by yourself." For a moment, everything froze in silence. He pushed the spoon aside and gloomily realized, shifting the date in his past life would no longer allow the events to repeat. A memory stabbed painfully, a distorted, bloodied face from that future which had already been erased. He lunged forward, sharply turned, and called the second brother. The hand heavily dropped onto the armrest. The order sounded muffled but cut sharply. As soon as everyone finishes eating, the brother must immediately take the younger ones and hide with them in the room. The worried young man asked the older brother if he could handle all the guests by himself. He sternly pushed him out with an order, "Go to the room and under no circumstances come out." Tense silence hangs in the frame. The boy suddenly shuddered. So far, the first visitors were already steadily approaching the yard, still slowly, but more with each moment. The elder gave the men an order in an even tone, "Clean up here properly," and they readily and sincerely agreed. He deliberately sent the younger ones ahead, but the anxiety did not subside. Suddenly, in the silence, the quick pounding of bare feet and a piercing cry broke out, "Older brother." A crying toddler rushed swiftly into the room. Noticing the crying Hohen, the elder stopped moving and sharply turned back. The child rushed forward at full speed and threw himself at him. The boy convulsively held on to him, breaking into bitter sobs. The young man pressed the little one to himself, hiding his darkened gaze, and almost whispered, asking where the rest were now. Earlier, they had already had brutal clashes with the Chagan gang. Little Tangoyol whimpered and froze when the big guy in black disdainfully threw something right in his face, as if to say he was a pathetic orphan. The boy didn't even have time to blink. A heavy boot smashed into his jaw with a swing. It didn't even look like a fight, just a merciless beating, where one drove the other under the ruler. Although Tangoyol was predicted to be a future martial arts genius, at that time he was still completely inexperienced. He looked just like all the other weak children. A young man in white burst into the room and froze, as if the air itself had stiffened from surprise. Any open break with the bandits would mean ruin for their newly established school. Two thugs silently, boldly bit into the newcomer with their gazes. Realizing what this would mean for the teacher, the young man instantly dropped to his knees before the offenders and loudly blurted out an apology. He almost pressed his head to the floor and begged for it to look like nothing had happened. Beaten Tangoyol stared through tears at what had happened, and that day ended for him as the first and last. The young man tightly hugged the little one to himself, but suddenly his merciless, desperate gaze fell right into the boy's heart so sharply that in a moment all the childhood dreams shattered. He darted from the spot, but all his life was gnawed by regret over that very moment. "This time I will not repeat the same mistake," he firmly vowed in his thoughts and pressed the child to himself. Nearby, very close, three men in black mercilessly kicked the boy, who in despair begged them not to touch the senior student. For a moment, everything froze in oppressive silence. The leader of the attackers curled his lips with disgust. Irritation choked him from all this fuss. He jerked to the other side, but the bloodied hand sharply grabbed his boot. The boy, beaten to blood, lifted his head, holding back tears in his eyes, and through clenched teeth hoarsely uttered a request to apologize. The big guy fiercely fixed his gaze on the ground and snapped, "So you will apologize for calling you a younger orphan." A heavy boot struck the young man's head with a swing. He fell, choking on blood, against the backdrop of the enemy's cold mockery of the pitiful orphans. Blood streamed down his forehead and dripped onto his lips, but the student stubbornly held his gaze, not looking away. The young man and the girl froze in place, and with a look full of shock, they watched the body of the senior student. It helplessly tore away and flew off under a new scream. He fixed his gaze on the stranger and sharply clarified whether he was by any chance a young master from Chagan's gang. He only glanced briefly over his shoulder, lowering his gaze from above. The youthful face twisted with furious rage. He clenched his fists so tightly that his fingers went numb from the tension. In the center of the room unfolded a pitiful scene. A beaten boy kneeling, a frightened girl pressed in fear, and the offender in black standing arrogantly and boldly. The big guy steadily straightened to his full height and disdainfully, with cold contempt, cast his gaze down at the beaten boy from above. A confused silence hung in the room for a moment. The boy with the broken head raised his gaze and, recognizing his senior student, exhaled with relief and hope. The young man crushed his fist with a crunch, fully aware of it himself. It would get even tougher from here. Tears choked the girl as she, through trembling sobs, blurted out, "This scoundrel was the first to barge in here and then called them dirty orphans." The young master grimaced disgustedly and threw out a phrase that he would not even remotely apologize. At that very moment, a devastating blow wiped the confident smile from his face, smearing it on the spot. The body of the offender flew across the room and hit the far corner, while the stunned witnesses helplessly froze in place. The younger students froze in place and clung intently with their gaze to the back of their senior, as if she were an immovable support. A bright, carefree smile of a child flashed for a moment right before his eyes. The young man glanced at his own scarred hand and in his thoughts reached out to the teacher, to apologize. Stubbornness in his gaze sharply grew and became heavier. He tore off his brakes and decisively took a step forward. A crimson aura rose around the enemy. He jerked his head in shock and hissed, "You hit me." From the blow of rage, his eyes flashed with white light. He fiercely lunged at the insolent one, not even realizing how this worthless student dared to strike at him at all. The young man burst out with a frantic battle cry, as if exploding from within instead of excuses. The beaten younger students, unable to hold back tears, stared in shock at the back of their senior. With the last remnants of patience, the opponent lunged and raised his hand for a devastating blow. A crimson fist with a terrifying rumble chopped through the air. But the youth did not take a single step back. He firmly caught the deadly strike with his bare palm. The senior student was sharply thrown backward in a flash of red energy. With a rumble, he passed through the floor with his back, and the panicked screams of the younger adepts exploded at once. The crowd openly mocked. Rumors about the youth's worthlessness were true, so challenging such an opponent was a futile endeavor. The boy himself realized this. Heavy breathing tore through the cloud of dust, and he struggled to still organize the basic principles of internal energy. He had never been lucky in martial arts simply from birth. The enraged enemy sharply sprang to his feet and clenched his fist, and a crimson aura flared around him. A lunge. A rough, merciless blow struck the youth directly in the chest. The boy painfully gasped, absorbing the full force of the strike. He was sharply thrown backward, his boots scraped loudly across the boards. It seemed everything was over, but the young man stubbornly clenched his trembling fists, and this only ignited a predatory, confident smile on the attacker. With a battle cry, the elder rushed forward and burst from his place like lightning, deciding to practically test how much the younger could withstand a blow. The young man barely managed to grit his teeth and cross his arms, preparing for a dull blocking strike. The exhausted young man stubbornly raised his fists upward, and around his body blue mist flared in waves. Fear flickered in the opponent's gaze. He instantly recognized the unleashed inner energy. The man in black abruptly sprang from his place. Only blurred shadows remained in the frame, and the shining hand struck him with a lightning counterattack right in the chest. The young man hoarsely said that he accepted the fight not for the younger students to watch him being beaten. The shaken enemy with a scratched face snarled madly at the audacious one. In blind rage, he rushed forward and gripped the boy's collar with a death grip. A moment and the dual, breathing tension breaks into a comedic explosion of dust. Chaotic kicks negate any logic of the fight. Several spectators exchanged confused glances and, unable to hide their contempt, called this mess a pathetic dogfight. The man in black suddenly leaned back, his broken forehead burning painfully, and he exclaimed in shock to the senior student. Immediately, a crying woman and a little girl rushed to the beaten young man. The girl cried out so loudly that tears flowed even more. However, the boy looked calmly at the situation. Ordinary fists without strength did not leave him serious wounds. Cowering in fear, the enemy sharply jumped back as the relentless youth once again took a fighting stance, and the blue aura flared even brighter. An oppressive silence is approaching. One more moment, and the clash will happen. Blood flowed from the boy's broken nose, but suddenly he recognized the same blue aura man. He decided in his thoughts to put an end to everything and with force to the crack, clenched his fist. In the dark kimono, the opponent shuddered. His face was sharply distorted by surprise. He dashed forward lightning fast. The youth abruptly sprang from his place, and his right hand was immediately enveloped by dazzling blue energy. A deafening crack rang out as the shining blade struck directly at the opponent and with a crash threw him back. In the dim light of the hall, the man shook his head and admitted with regret. He had no idea that silently enduring all this was so painful. Blood floods the young man's hand, and he fixes his gaze on his own bloodied palm, acknowledging the bitter truth. It seems he no longer believed in it at all. Behind him, children were sobbing in tears, and he silently repented in his thoughts, scolding himself for still carrying the title of older brother. Forcing himself to smile, he deflected with a joke. At this rate, their students will be the first to fall. The stranger in black suddenly dropped to the floor in fright. The young man loomed over him and, clenching his fists tensely, did not take his eyes off him. A heavy step has been taken. It is time to put an end to the old enmity forever. The enemy panicked and quickly crawled back to the rear, choking on excuses. Supposedly, they had only met today. His face contorted with horror. The young man, unable to hold back, swung and punched him silently. He had already suffered enough in his past life. Flames burst before his eyes. Because of his own weakness, the sect flared up and vanished to ashes, and the crowd withdrew. From the air, he delivered a devastating blow. The opponent was pressed tightly against the boards. A sudden, devastating blow cut off his advance, and he fell to the ground. The man plunged down, flipping in the air, and with a loud crash fell onto the wooden floor. Someone's hand with numb fingers clung tightly to his boot. The boy in white mercilessly dragged him across the floor, as if packing him into a sack. The fallen man shouted in panic and frantically questioned whether that petty bastard even realized whom he dared to raise his hand against. Only an icy, piercing gaze served as an answer for him. Pressing the captive with his knee, the young man calmly said, "He perfectly understands whom he is dealing with," and completely ignored the hysterical screams about a psychopath. A heavy and sweeping fist struck the air of the Chagan gang with all its might right in the face, and the victor knew well. The father of the one who was beaten would never let this go. Blood gushed from the broken nose, and the air miserably mumbled apologies. But the hand with the fist raised for another blow froze in the air. The young man solemnly and firmly made a vow to himself. He would never live the old way again. At that very moment, the space was pierced by the furious scream of an older man. He demanded explanations. The beaten man whined pitifully, pressing against his father, while the young man only weakly exhaled in response, as if he had no strength left. He slowly got to his feet and released the frightened victim who, trembling, panicked and recoiled away. Swift footsteps instantly shattered the silence. The rumble of hurried boots rolled over the hall faster and faster. An angry man burst into the hall with a crash. He was looking for the one who dared to threaten his son. His gaze flashed to the side like lightning, and he instantly froze, as if gripped by silence. Chagan, the gang leader, boldly approached the sect leader and directly confronted him, demanding immediate explanations for how he received the guests. The man with the fan tried to turn the fight into an ordinary children's quarrel, but he was immediately sharply stopped. The father sharply yanked the beaten son by the scruff of the neck. The boy stood, covered in bruises, gasping heavily after the humiliation he endured. The sect leader only lowered his gaze and fell silent. Suddenly, the silence was cut by a vicious scream. The voice called him a scoundrel. Chagan was boiling with rage. He trembled at the very thought that some nameless orphan dared to raise a hand against his child. The accused young man remained completely calm, reproaching himself in his thoughts only for one thing: he did not send the younger students to disperse to the rooms. The kids, with tears tore into him, clung to his robe and cried out that the rich kid was the first to strike and wrong their father. The beaten offender shuddered and froze in fear because the young man fixed him with an icy gaze and decisively stood up to defend his brother. The enemies harshly ordered the beaten young man to be silent and not to interfere in the adult's conversation. A heavy, gloomy shadow quickly enveloped his mentor. He ordered dryly and coldly, "From now on, speak only with him." The young man leaned back, letting the teacher pass so that he stood between him and the opponent. The chief disciple of the hostile sect spoke apologetically. Allegedly, everything exploded because of insults he supposedly said towards the orphan sister. While he argued and complained about the fight, the young man sharply replied that he acted not out of whim. He was simply doing what an older brother should do. "How dare this bastard at all?" the mentor shouted, furiously raising his fist in a fit of rage. A dark determination flared in the boy's eyes, but in a moment he jerked his whole body. The teacher stepped forward and, in a cold, measured tone, challenged the opponent with a question. Did he just allow himself to laugh? Complete dead silence. The mentor's face froze under the pressure of murderous anger. He loomed over the enemy like a terrible shadow, and the stunned student could only exhale in disbelief, recognizing his teacher in this attacker. The man, without breaking his calm, followed the bold girl and the stunned old man with his gaze and coldly remarked that she was clearly entertaining him. At that very second, the courtyard was covered by a thick, dark aura. He was sure he had stayed quiet for too long. A wave of dense, heavy, and oppressive dark energy burst from him. His gaze grew colder like ice. The elder muttered distrustfully under his breath. Someone dared to raise such an uproar right in the heart of the Sanghamun sect. The elder, all agitated, sharply recoiled and immediately gave an order. The students immediately get inside and treat the wounds, while the girl was breathing heavily and deeply. Barely restraining his trembling, the old man respectfully addressed him as the head of the Yu sect. He smiled fiercely and barely noticeably in the half-darkness, and boldly gave the young master a mocking advice to go for help. Nothing extra was needed. As soon as the uninvited guests appeared, they immediately started to leave. Before disappearing from sight, the elder snapped out a nervous wish that no danger would threaten him on the road. The man froze in place without a word and listened to their footsteps approaching. As soon as silence separated them, he spoke in a hushed voice to the beaten Khvaya. The teacher solemnly and firmly promised, if anyone tries to get to her again, let them do as they see fit. He will take all the consequences upon himself. The young man in dirty clothes, covered in scratches, froze, and confusion was reflected in his gaze. Only now did he finally realize he had never truly managed to understand his teacher. Before his eyes flashed a hall bathed in sunlight. There they were, the three of them, still children, standing around the mentor and bowing before him. That damn puppy maliciously burst out from a completely different place from where no one expected it. Against the backdrop of a crimson sunset stood the leader of the enemy faction. His people stood beside him. The subordinate, crazed from beatings, tried to defend himself with words, saying that he deliberately pushed the Sanghamun students. The goal boiled down to one thing: to break their spirit, to tear Yu Hyunjin out of the sect, and to remove that threat forever. The leader suddenly darkened as soon as he remembered the piercing gaze of the boy. If this guy with such eyes leads Sanghamun, it's the end for all of them. The man suddenly froze in place. He muttered barely audibly under his breath, and immediately a heavy, dark aura spread in the air. The entire predatory essence flared on the mustached man's face. A bloody smile curled his lips, time to push the inquiry into action. The night darkness covered the silence of the Bramsun Ui estate. The young man casually threw his hands behind his head and stretched out on the bed in the dimly lit room. He laughed quietly, replaying the recent threat from his master in his memory. He could not even imagine that someone would dare to cause such a commotion within their walls, and now he was watching with pleasure as everyone without exception got scared. The boy laughed sincerely as soon as he realized and acknowledged the skill that turned out to be unexpectedly strong. His mood broke in an instant and he turned his back to the wall. At first he intended to handle everything alone, stubbornly like a fool, but now he was unbearably tormented by guilt. Before, he silently endured everything alone, closed his eyes and kept enduring, but the constant taste of guilt finally broke his will to live. A barely audible rustle sounded behind the door and a timid plea opened it. "Come in." The young man instantly sat up on the bed and called his younger brother. "Come in." His face instantly lit up with a sincere, warm smile. The door slid aside and a young apprentice froze on the threshold as if afraid to take an extra step. The elder briefly patted the bed beside him and asked if the boy was okay. The boy stumbled over his words but almost immediately assured him he was fine. But the apprentice still did not move from his place. With concern, he again asked the elder if he had any pain anywhere. He clenched his fist so tightly that it even cracked. The long-haired youth barely whispered that he was dying, and his companion almost turned gray with fear, hoarsely calling for a doctor. And then the patient suddenly burst out laughing and briskly got to his feet, but it was only a merciless trick. For a moment the world stood still without movement. The elder, with a warm smile, gently patted the frightened boy on the crown and quietly spoke words of thanks. And suddenly he sharply and firmly grabbed his hand. The youth barely smiled and only then realized that for the first time in his 2 lives, such honest, boundless devotion was before him. The apprentice blazed with pride and inspiredly declared that he would definitely become just like his master. The elder blinked confusedly several times. The boy sharply took a fighting stance, burning with youthful zeal, while the mentor silently froze in stupor. In a moment, the boy abruptly turned around and ran away, leaving him alone in the dimly lit room. A confused question flashed in his mind: why fate chose him. He flew with all his might through the night corridors and suddenly stopped, as if crashing into silence in his own place. The boy had learned to endure blows since childhood because he grew up as an ordinary beggar. Gaining momentum, he delivered a powerful kick and threw him back, pushing almost with the force of an impulse. He bent down on the ground to the point of pain, coughing through the disgust and the pain. In the impenetrable darkness, 3 threatening figures descended upon him. "Excellent, I'm listening. No one will cover the boy." Older boys mercilessly kicked him, forcing him to give up the food he begged for during the day. He pressed his battered head with his palms without words, as if trying to hide it from all eyes. That was how his whole life looked. The boy cautiously stretched along the noisy evening market, step by step sneaking so that no one would hear. A beggar who dares to do any deed, if only to manage to survive. The gaze fixed mercilessly on the tight wallet on the belt of that inattentive passerby. The broken hand trembled, barely reaching, stretched toward the stranger's belt. The boy suddenly found himself on the ground and froze, pressed in the darkness in fascination before the predatory red eyes. Cold sweat ran down his cheek. This is how he first came across his teacher. The impassive man silently extended his hand to the frightened boy. But this clan never accepted him as their own. The night silence was shattered by a furious scream, a cry accusing him of attacking the younger students. The enraged older brother loomed over him from above, while he obediently lowered his eyes, hiding his gaze. A heavy memory melted over the estate in the morning, and along with it came a long yawn. The boy comfortably sprawled on the bed and did not even suspect that his wounds would only heal in 4 days. He clenched his fist, realizing the secret inner art of Manhwa was behind all this. Suddenly, the door of the room burst open with a terrible crash. A soot-covered younger apprentice froze on the threshold and, stunned, with wide-open eyes, fixed his gaze on the second elder. The young man carefully ran his fingers over his cheek, washing away the dirt, and with warmth in his voice asked if the little one had tried to cook again. The young man often blinked, his face covered in soot, and his cheeks deeply flushed crimson. He whispered embarrassedly that he only wanted to enhance the taste of the food with a light, smoky tint. The elder only sighed heavily and remarked there was no need to go that far. He ordered the little one to wash before breakfast. But he, full of frantic energy, rushed off to chop wood and carry water while the mentor stood, confused and silently watching this hyperactivity. The boy looked at his back with such a tense, almost fanatical gaze. The memory revealed the picture completely. The boy once carelessly let slip that the elder was the first to switch to their side. Then Chekva froze, surprise burst from her gaze. And the little one, clenching his fists until they hurt, fervently vowed to grow up and become his exact full copy. But the emotional truth burst out exactly at the moment when, during washing, he accidentally burned a huge hole in his clothes. Remembering how Chekva awkwardly smiled through those burnt rags, the elder finally understood everything. He closed his eyelids with relief. This time his decision turned out to be correct. A sharp, unexpected call made him flinch. He instantly turned around, almost bumping into Chekva. He immediately relaxed, smiled warmly, and asked the girl to braid his hair before sitting down to eat. At his words, she joyfully lit up. Someone firmly grasped his palm and finally gave the silence and peace he had waited for so long. The young man smiled softly. Now he could finally live peacefully, alongside his younger pupils. Holding hands, they walked steadily straight towards the dazzling glow. Flash and the estate was immediately engulfed by roaring flames, as if the fire had torn itself from the inside of the world. His whole body was frozen with shock. He sharply looked back in the very heart of the hellish fire, completely losing track of where the fire could have come from. His face twisted with horror, and he barely whispered an address to the elder. So much darkness that no boundary remains. On the burning floor, the bodies of students pierced by swords lay limp, and someone's bloodied hand convulsively reached forward in vain, pleading for rescue. The young man froze in place and defenselessly stared at his destroyed friends. But the fiery walls suddenly crashed right into him. The blow instantly scattered him and knocked him off his feet. The unbearable heat burned the skin painfully. With a sharp wheeze, he abruptly opened his eyelids, but it was only a dream. Confused, he realized he was lying in his own bed. Barely able to recover and calm down, the darkness above his head parted, and from it loomed a terrifying shadow with a glow in its eyes. In the dense crimson darkness, one question suddenly surfaced. Had he woken up? A deafening silence fell and gave no answer. A shadow quietly tore from the ceiling and landed right in the room where the man was sleeping. He jerks awake and sharply opens his eyes as if there had just been a feeling that finally everything was falling into place. Smiles of relatives flashed in his memories, and with his own hands he rewrote the past that he now so fiercely regretted. Trembling ran through his fingers, they convulsively clung to the blanket, and the young man stubbornly believed that a much better future day awaited him ahead. But the body suddenly lost movement. It froze. Poison. Above the bed already loomed a stranger. He smiled coldly and threw a taunt that it would have been better to simply die quietly in sleep. In the oppressive darkness, a blade flashed coldly. The killer disdainfully stepped with his toe on the edge of the bed. The victim still could not move. He narrowed his eyes fiercely, preparing to deliver the final blow. The blade whistled as it plunged into the mattress, but the young man made an incredible lunge at the moment of death and fell to the floor. He twitched in pain and curled up, pressing his palms to his chest. Old wounds would not let the air out. The attacker, stunned, glanced around, unable to comprehend how the paralyzed man managed to break free from the attack and dodge in time. The young man greedily gasped cold air, fixing his gaze on the wood, and suddenly realized the chalk-by powder was insufficient for paralysis. Lying amid the flickering blue energy he felt, his body obeyed him again. The killer above confidently threw out a sure statement. The victim would not take another step. The boy feverishly calculated, in a direct confrontation with a professional mercenary, he would not cope. He parted his lips and noticeably gathered himself to tear a scream from his chest. But there were exactly 150 steps left to the mentor's saving bedroom. Silence. A heavy boot pressed even closer. With bloodshot eyes, he flashed and finished off the victim with one decisive blow. But to the younger sister's room, only 20 steps remained. The young man weakly ground his teeth and threw an insult at the enemy bastard. The mercenary disdainfully and ironically nodded in agreement. The scream would indeed hit right in the field of vision of the powerful master. But by the time he appears, the blade will have already managed to cut the throat of the sleeping child. The enemy threw him an offer, silently accept death. The young man, trapped, realized with horror there was simply no other way to save her. His fist pressed against the floor and clenched convulsively, producing a sharp crack. The youth fell to his knees on the floor, gasping for air, and frantically ran through his mind. How did he even manage to trust someone? Above his head loomed a mercenary, an unknown killer who calmly and cold-bloodedly gave the order to die with dignity. The sharp dagger blade relentlessly pierced the way down. But instead of accepting death, the boy suddenly dived under the enemy's arm. He sharply lunged forward and hit the mercenary right in the legs, knocking him off balance. The youth finally realized you have to hit the legs, and with all his might, he clung tightly to the heavy metal stand that was on the floor. The tension reached its limit. The killer froze in shock and forcibly uttered it, not understanding why he was still able to move until the metal, with a sharp crack, shattered his bone. The boy struck, probably already realizing, if he maims this freak now, he will no longer be able to cause harm. The space was cut by a wild scream filled with pain. Now the second, the young man fiercely clenched his words, fixing a mad gaze and cutting off the mercenary's pitiful curses. The metal again tore through the air with a whistle, slicing the silence. A powerful blow threw the killer back, and with a loud crash pressed him into the floor. The wounded young man grabbed his head and quietly cursed the stubborn opponent. The masked killer tightly grips the dagger and growls hoarsely. Only one contract prevents him from forcing a plea for death. The lad heavily sank to the ground, clutching his bloodied hand, and yet barely smiled. His plan worked. The mercenary loomed over the victim and raised the blade, preparing the final strike. The young man calmly and evenly closed his eyes, confident that even after his death his comrades would remain safe. A sudden flash in the air was cut by the harsh sound of sliced flesh. The boy blinked confusedly and barely opened one eye. The killer froze in place, and a thin bloody line slowly appeared on his neck. Blood spurted from the slashed throat in a powerful fountain. A gaze full of surprise. The massive body of the mercenary crashed to the floor with a loud thud, and the invisible savior prudently inquired whether the young man was unharmed. Behind the corpse, a male figure with a sword emerged, frozen like a ghost. "Teacher," he blurted out in a confused breath when he recognized a familiar face in the darkness. The mentor sharply turned his gaze aside, instantly assessing the situation. In a pool of blood on the floor lay a lifeless corpse, and nearby, covered in cuts, KHVI weakly slid down and sank, miraculously surviving the attack. The mentor clenched his teeth fiercely and, without looking away from the bloodied student, ground them. The boy opened his mouth to start a conversation, but the master abruptly cut him off and ordered him in a hoarse command to follow. Noticing the shock on the student's face, he threw words over his shoulder as if leaning on them. He must behave like a real teacher at least once. His face froze like a verdict, in pure determination. They silently cut through the night courtyard, keeping a steady pace. HWI suddenly tensed, realizing the path would lead straight to the territory of the Chagan gang to Guak Sahu. Only these thugs were actually looking for a way to plant a hired killer on him, but they never found direct evidence. The master abruptly stopped and clenched his fist with a painful crunch. He whispered to HWI. Under the moonlight, he solemnly and firmly announced that today he would pass on to him one of the sword techniques. The memory of a past life confused the young man. Back then, he had devoted a whole year to studying the sword of heavenly will. He looked at the mentor in confusion, trying to catch why he was in such a hurry, but found no answer. The master grimly tore off his mask and admitted he had always dreamed of never passing this technique to his students. Staring into the darkness of the night courtyard, he made a decision to show it right now. The boy froze for a moment. He swallowed convulsively and, hearing the stern order to watch, to feel, and to forever engrave what is seen into the soul, clenched inwardly, as if the words were being driven straight into memory. Just a moment, the man smiled softly, truly hoping that the young man would never follow his path. After that, he turned around and, silently shifting his feet, step by step disappeared into the darkness. Suddenly, the silence was cut by a powerful swing of a blade like a hurricane. A real commotion arose. Frightened guards sprang up at the shout, sounding the alarm about a stranger's attack. One of the fighters held a spear forward and forced the unknown to state his name. A heavy boot sharply struck a stone with a swing, and before the leap into the air, a thick cloud of dust rose. From the thick smoke emerged a tall warrior and stood forward, shielding the frightened girl. He cast a cold glance from above at the armed guards and ordered in an icy tone to deliver a message to their leader. The man's eyes flashed fiercely with a bright gleam. He declared, "The head of the Songamun clan himself has arrived in person." In the night fog, the lone swordsman advanced straight to the armed guards before the massive gates. The young student KHVI instantly turned pale as soon as he realized there could be no talk of any peace negotiations anymore. With a strike and a continuous roar, the fragments scattered. The master brazenly broke down the main gates and stepped inside without any tricks. The man casually turned on the spot and sharply, without unnecessary words, ordered KHVI to watch everything around carefully. He decisively took a step forward straight towards the spears of the guards. A thin streak of blood suddenly appeared on the neck of one of the enemies. He touched the wound in confusion. "The beginning is always hidden in silence," the master said evenly. KHVI froze, immediately recognizing the familiar movement. This was the sword drawing the first stance of the sword of heavenly will. The boy finally understood. The promise to pass on the art had turned into a real lesson right in battle, and the master had already summoned the power of lightning. A dazzling golden pillar of energy pierced through the darkness, the strike of the falling sword, from which everything seemed doomed. The swordsman's eyes flared crimson, and he instantly transformed into a sharp horizontal lunge, spreading the earth. A gigantic whirlwind, tearing space with wind and blades, hurled the guards into the air and mercilessly shredded their bodies. The young man froze in the clouds of smoke. Everything was unfolding exactly according to the scenario he had once memorized in a past life. The surviving enemies, thrown into panic, rushed to flee and loudly tried to call their leader. Sweat rolled down the boy's face. Could this really be the true power of his master? But this was only the start. The mentor calmly gripped the blade, and the surrounding space suddenly began to rise with heat, warming up right before their eyes. A lightning-fast strike broke the silence with a sharp blow and left a bloody trail. A piercing cold approached closely with it. The master continuously carved his way forward, cutting through opponents as if they had momentarily stood in his path, while deadly energies intertwined around him in dense rings. A flash and streams of fire and yin merged into one continuous devastating whirlwind. The apprentice froze for a moment and held his breath. Throughout his life, he had perceived this sword style as something ordinary, without any distinction, without any prominence. The giant aura of the blade stubbornly destroyed the entire Chagan gang by itself and eventually scattered them to dust. A sudden electric shock pierced his consciousness. Here it was, the sword of heavenly will. Walking through the bloodied courtyard, the young man finally realized why 4 influential sects had been so relentlessly trying to arrange a meeting with his teacher. When he caught up with him, the realization struck. Today was the first time he saw what his power was truly capable of. The man sharply glanced back and gave the order to retreat. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps were heard one after another. From the darkness emerged the grim leader of the Sanghamun sect. He firmly held a pair of axes in his hands. His gaze flared red as soon as he growled about the terrible crime. In panic, the frightened HWI called out to his mentor, but he only quietly and evenly said his name in response. In the midst of the threat, Sahu calmly and without trembling responded to the question. Had the student finally understood the true essence of the Sword of Heavenly Will? HWI froze in confusion. It was a very bad time for lectures. Sahu paid no attention to such things. Their technique obeyed the laws of heaven, but the sword was still held by an ordinary person. And if one were to forge a completely new path in this art, he would create his own unique weapon from it. Tension hung in the air. Armed enemies tightly drew the ring around the two and had already closed it. The sect leader finally broke loose. Their outward calm only made him angrier, and he shouted that after attacking his people, they would not leave here alive. Suddenly, a huge axe hung in the way and blocked the road, but the guest did not blink. He quietly, without the slightest tremor, continued to demand his due. The mustached leader snorted contemptuously. The golden blade was mercilessly aimed straight at him. The master slowly descended from the heavens, clutching the weapon he had vowed never to take again. He fell heavily and dully right into the very heart of the enemy crowd. The guards jerked back sharply, frightened by a wave of dust. The swordsmen sharply accused them of attacking the great disciple of the Sanghamun school. The swordsman stated with icy detachment that as a mentor he had no right to stand aside and bluntly named the mustached man guilty. He was the one who planted killers on the disciple. The mustached man swallowed hard convulsively and sharply fired a question about evidence. The guest sharply cut off. There is no evidence because he came here immediately under the furious screams of the bandits. The helmsman with an axe stepped forward and with fierce fury poured reproaches on the swordsman for the beaten people. He again smugly grinned. There is no evidence, but the gang believes it has the right, so the guest better leave right now. The warrior with an axe cut through the smoke with a loud shout. Without evidence, they have no business here. Thick fog twisted and curled right underfoot. The dark-haired man threw an indifferent face aside, assuring that he would spare his life thanks to old connections, and promised to extract an answer from him for this day. He barely audibly snorted with a smile. Then he covered his face with his palm and burst into loud laughter, completely confusing the enemy. Ominous darkness closed around his figure, and he cold-bloodedly cut off. This is the fate of the living, not the dead. The big guy barely managed to blink in confusion. Only a moment, and a lightning-fast bloody slash already cut through his chest. A devastating blow threw the body backward. Heavy axes slipped from hands and no longer obeyed. He fell to the ground, never understanding where the attack came from, and beside him his companion was choking on a scream of pure fear. The witness froze in place, stunned by the inhuman strength of Yu Hyunjun. In the darkness, the swordsman's eye flashed predatory, and he immediately pronounced the final verdict. Today the Chagan gang will disappear forever from Anson County. He sharply lunged forward with a predatory jerk, cutting through the thick fog. Crimson energy flared and the enemy was thrown back, his chest torn apart. A wide sword strike sliced the air and mercilessly swept opponents from his path. The space trembled under the heavy blow. The girl froze in place, unable to look away from what she saw. In the smoke clouds emerged the silhouette of the master. His strikes, by the heavenly will of the sword, bent the surviving enemies into animal fear. A new blade strike, sharp and devastating, fell upon everything around, turning the space into a bloody massacre. More precisely, it looked like a continuous absolute massacre, where enemy bodies were torn into small pieces. A figure shrouded in darkness with burning eyes looked like the true embodiment of disaster. Suddenly, a blue aura flared over the girl's body, and her man-heart involuntarily responded to the foreign power. She tensed sharply and, catching the resonance, finally clearly felt the true nature of his strength. This fog turned out to be not something accidental, but the released energy of the master. The Kai was so dense that it managed to take physical form and tore people apart at a distance, even when the blade touched nothing. A dazzling cross-shaped flash tore through the darkness, spewing out combat mastery that no longer fit into any framework. A destructive whirlwind covered the battlefield, scattering everything around and forcing the survivors to scream in panic about a monster and flee without looking back. The commander tried with all his might to hold the formation and shouted hoarsely at his subordinates, demanding that they immediately come to their senses. Suddenly, a sharp whistle passed through the air, and it froze as if it was nailed to the spot. Nearby, two other warriors tense sharply and fix their gaze intently on the thick dust. The young man trembles with horror, and his mouth does not obey, not a single word can be uttered. A bloody flash, and the senior warrior was instantly cut in half. Escaped from him with a gaping mouth, and the empty gaze still did not allow the brain to catch the moment of death. The wounded man froze his gaze, confusedly fell on the fallen body, as if crushed by a blow. He clenched his teeth until they cracked. The cosmos unleashed a furious roar, and along with it, a whirlwind of crimson energy surged and tore everything around. The enraged father lunged forward and cursed, as if spitting the curses on the go. The axe cut through the air with a bloody crescent, but still could not find its target. A thick fog covers the battlefield. Clashing weapons, the gang leader Chagan sharply stepped forward and growled, ordering the killer of his son to come into the light. His eyes filled with a bloody haze. Breaking into a furious roar, he blindly began to fiercely slash the smoke swirling around him to pieces. Suddenly, through the veil, a foreign silhouette clearly appeared. The leader made a heavy lunge forward and immediately turned him into a target for attack. The young man harshly reproached in his thoughts, "The enemy wants to vent his anger on him, not on the mentor." The enraged leader sprang from his place and burst into attack, felling the boy with a devastating blow from both axes. A sharp whistle of sliced air. Feeling the abyss opening in the magic, the young man tensed to the limit, and he had nothing left but a single path. He fixed his gaze, trying with all desperation not to lose sight of any movement of Guak Sahu. His body acted on pure instinct, and he miraculously slipped away from the wide, devastating swing. The big man twisted his face in a malicious grin and laughed through hatred, immediately aiming at him and calling him a miserable rat. But in the very next moment, a lightning strike tore through his own chest, and blood sprayed into the air in a thick fountain. Gasping blood through his mouth, he fell heavily to the ground, and through the smoke, the gates of Sun Ui were recognized on his face. "Mentor," the young man exhaled with relief. In the thick dust, a tall figure slowly emerged, the bare sword in its hand gleaming in the haze of dust. The mentor bent over the fallen enemy and dryly, without a trace of emotion, asked, "Is it true that this merciless blade is his chosen path?" The big man only shuddered with fierce terror, and blood continuously flowed down him, streaming downward. Around spread a field of corpses, dozens of slain fighters already rested in puddles. Assessing what had happened, Guak Sahu tore his throat in a frantic scream and still could not come to terms. The mentor had unleashed such a bloody slaughter just for one mercenary. The old man spat out a clot of black blood and fixed his gaze on his killer rage, and shock burned in his expression. With a sharp whistle, the sword fell down for the finishing blow. A fountain of blood splashed onto the hands and weapon of the victor. The warrior's face was thickly covered in crimson, and he, without changing his calm, quietly asked if she was watching attentively. The girl in white hung in the crowd of bloodied bodies and almost silently confirmed what had happened. Heavy sorrow was red in her blue eyes, like a reflection on icy water. Surveying the place of the massacre, she quietly confessed, this was too sad. Only with a barely perceptible smile did the man answer. All at once their night had completely cleared the field of enemies. Dawn slowly spread light over the roofs of the ancient city. The Chagan gang was no longer seen in Anson County. Its existence was ended forever. Somewhere very far from there, in a gloomy hall where dozens of lit candles flickered, someone sat in deep meditation on a raised platform. It was a man, behind whose gaze hid a terrifying mask of a red demon. But suddenly the flames around him flared sharply, brightly, damn boldly. In the deaf shadows very deep, the man in the red demonic mask sat motionless before a black candle, and from each of his exhales burst clouds of dark energy. With malicious restraint he said this. In Anson County, one of their seeds disappeared without a trace. Without a doubt, Guak Chalu was involved with the local gang. He again felt how generous was the price the sect once took when it sheltered that boy. Behind him, like a phantom, appeared the face of a stern father next to a small son. In the silence, suddenly from the dark shadow, a voice burst out. It asked if he still remembered. The man nodded restrainedly, and the candle flame barely flickered. The sectarian chuckled hoarsely and flatly, did not believe that the heir of the powerful faction could have died so senselessly alone. He swore to find out everything thoroughly. But the interlocutor instantly cut off his phrase. Most likely, the elusive sword Sonungan also hovers over Anson. In the foggy gloom, a gloomy face emerged. This swordsman looked too cruel, stubborn, and relentless to the blind man. A heavy question hung in the air. Could it be that they would really leave him alone? The masked man barely restrained an outburst of anger. Because of this warrior, they had already ruined a whole bunch of their pawn nails, and now they had to pay with a valuable seed. No one even thought of forgiving this. The man in the crimson demonic mask slowly ran his fingers over his chin, as if lost in thought. He gave an order to his subordinate not to touch the blind man. The grand plan was already drawing its final stretch, and any unnecessary moves could only scare the prey. He threw out a phrase that they had enough nails, and then his eye clicked fiercely from under the mask, and in that gleam it was felt he would not stop there. Echoes of ringing battle cries reached the dark hall, and the leader calmly continued to meditate to this noise. Hundreds of young students synchronously cut the air with swords. The sect needed plenty of fresh seed. The man stretched a condescending smile. These fools had brought themselves into his hands, not even guessing what fate already awaited them. Suddenly, violet flames flared above the candlestick. Another target lit up in the sky. He extended his palm to the magical fire, and in a moment recognized in its flame the childlike energy from the Hwangan family. The dusty city square of another town stretched beneath the feet of the worn swordsman as he walked alongside the little girl. He, suddenly looking back in memories, sharply admitted he had once been a completely worthless scholar. The girl looked up in awe at his clothes, heavily soaked with blood, and the warrior solemnly explained that at least he had learned to read and write. The dullness of fatigue on his face melted into a slight smile. Literacy had helped him get a job in the trade guild. It was there that he found her, the kind woman with whom he eventually built a family. Once he truly smiled, holding his beloved wife tightly to himself. The girl froze with a stunned look and thought. The mentor once lived the most ordinary life, completely unrelated to the world of martial arts. Everything shattered in an instant as soon as people from the dark path addressed him. Strangers ordered him to steal the guild's trade books, and he firmly refused. But just a few days later, horror widened his eyes to the limit. But just a few days after his refusal, a bloody red darkness fell upon his home. He severed ties with his own family forever. Entering through the threshold of his home, the man froze in place before the broken room, his beloved lying motionless in a crimson puddle. His wife was brutally deprived of life, and their little son suddenly disappeared without a trace. My wife, despair pierced his voice, and he fell to his knees, clasping her with his arms, lifting her from the ground. These were exactly the people from the dark path. Silence stands motionless. He pressed the lifeless body tightly to his chest until the crunch in his body and convulsively shuddered while his sobs burst out. And it was then that he was completely overwhelmed. Everything started with a dull, blind desire for revenge. Despair distorted the man's face, and tears continuously rolled down his cheeks. He dreamed of only one thing: power. His gaze blazed. He desperately needed martial arts. But there was only one obstacle. At that age, starting training was already too late. No one even moved a finger to extend a helping hand. The bystanders were completely indifferent to the destitute scientist. Hope slowly faded, disappearing with every moment. Everything turned upside down the moment the exhausted, battered, and bloodied man finally faced his benefactor. The girl beside him whispered Manhwa, and he only nodded silently in response. That day he accepted the ancient treatises in a mystical light, the techniques of Manhwa and Chong Yui and the very will of heaven. One night the swordsman accidentally came across the old scientist and took from him a tattered manual of martial arts. He confessed, long ago he had found it in an old bookstore. The warrior gloomily drank in the sight of the old volumes, slowly gazing into their worn pages. It was a book of completely unknown origin. He made the new technique obsessive, polishing sword strikes for hours, scattering heavy, powerful whirlwinds around him. Suddenly he was seized by a sharp attack. He convulsively grabbed his chest, and a pulsating red glow burst from it. Crimson energy burst from his body in an explosion, tearing and shredding his clothes to rags. He bent over in half and, breaking into a heavy choking cough, tore a bloody mass from his chest. This power had already pulled him to the very edge more than once, only a thin hair away from death. His muscles finally betrayed him, and he collapsed face first into the dirt without resistance. His fingers weakened, the hilt slipped from his hands. But even this turned out to be insufficient to stop him. The exhausted swordsman dropped to one knee in the forest, convulsively gripping his sword and spitting out blood. For if he still could not exact revenge, then it was better to die. With a sharp roar, he broke his own limits and tore the space with a crimson flash of aura. From a sudden powerful surge of force, a frightened flock of birds shattered the silence and took off into the sky. Shrouded in hot smoke, he staggered, but still forced himself to rise and stand on his feet. Dark energy pulsed in sharp lines right beside his eye, and sweat continuously streamed down his face. Probably because of this, Finally, he succeeded. He opened his sea of energy. He sharply cast a glance at his own scarred and trembling palm. Steam was still rising from it, and he clearly could not believe it and comprehend the heavenly intention. This exactly showed him the way, the path of Hell Chi. He clenched his fists so hard that the knuckles turned white. Hell Chi meant a blood debt and an injustice that only blood could wash away. Shrouded in thick smoke clouds, the swordsman froze amid the ruins. He personally wiped the dark sect off the face of the earth, the very one that his family took from him. And then he tracked down the puppeteer and pulled everything into a closed, endless circle of deaths, stitching each step into a vicious loop. After he destroyed 5 dark sects, the world forever remembered his named sword that pierces the clouds. Next to the apprentice, the man bitterly spoke the truth. His blade was indeed soaked with pain. Revenge did not bring peace. Instead, it left emptiness and a terrible message about the son's death. The warrior closed his eyelids and clenched within himself the memory of lost warmth, a smiling wife holding a baby in her arms. Silence. Beside the girl, he silently moved toward the gates, cutting off the shadows of the past behind him. The warrior, covered in soot and blood, abruptly stopped and shook off the clinging remnants from his shoulder. He softly stretched his lips into a kind smile for the confused young man. The master gently but heavily pressed his palm to the student's head and quietly confessed, before this meeting, he did not want to live at all. The same day surfaced again for him, the empty gaze of an exhausted child to whom he then reached out his hand. The boy suddenly froze. The words that he himself had given the master a chance for a new life knocked the ground out from under him. The man unclenched his battered palm right before his eyes, addressing the student as his savior, and swore that from now on he would always stand in his defense. The mentor's smile suddenly knocked the last remnants of composure out of the boy. He barely held back tears. After all, earlier in his past life, he simply hated him fiercely for that very coldness. The young man was instantly overwhelmed by burning shame. He had walked for years behind the mask of an invincible swordsman and had not noticed the pain of others. "Let's go inside," the master said, and the student finally allowed himself a genuine, warm smile. He shouted his agreement sharply and loudly, and with that, the stone finally fell from his soul. Later their paths crossed in the middle of the spacious school courtyard. Already washed and changed into clean clothes, the mentor firmly held a weapon in his hands. He solemnly handed the student his first own sword, not legendary, but fully capable of revealing the will of the heavens. The boy tightly grips the sword and rejoices in his thoughts. This start is nothing like his former life. The mentor ordered in a steady, restrained voice to show the technique of the will of the heavens. The student nodded immediately without hesitation, and the teacher indulgently said, "Forgetting the techniques is not a fault." The young man firmly, without hesitation, took a combat stance. The man crossed his arms and carefully watched as the student froze before the strike, preparing the movement. But suddenly a predatory, excited smile flashed on the boy's face. Forget, he had been practicing this craft until his very last breath, so even if he did not reach the absolute peak. The whole scene flared with a blue aura, and he, screaming wildly, rushed forward, throwing true will of the heavens at the opponent. The mentor was stunned. The blade whistled through the air and, cutting the silence, dragged behind it a powerful, energetic trail. He exhaled deeply and slowly lowered his palm onto the hilt. And in a moment the young man was sprinting with all his might along the mountain path, gulping air convulsively through his mouth. He instantly slowed down as soon as a surprised brother's shout sounded behind his back. "Rest," the voice sounded, and the boy wearily lowered his eyelids, allowing sweat to run down his face. Weakness overtook him instantly. His cheeks flushed with a deep crimson, and in his head he silently begged from shame. His eyes darkened sharply. Leaping up with a fierce battle cry, he pushed himself forward, pouring his last strength into a sword swing. A blue aura flared around the blade. And at that moment his weapon slipped from his hands without any chance to hold on, and his face blossomed with an expression of complete shock. The wooden blade spun in the air without a trace, completely senselessly, uncontrollably. The mentor did not even blink. With a practiced, habitual movement, he caught the weapon mid-flight. The young man stretched his legs along the ground, raising a cloud of dust, and stopped before the teacher, who did not move an inch. When the mentor bitterly admitted that he lacked the experience to teach such a student, the young man suddenly burst into tears and begged forgiveness for his worthlessness. The teacher gently stretched his lips into a warm smile and immediately explained, first, the frail body would have to be healed to become stronger. And now he was already running laps around the yard. A terrible thought gripped him. Because of his own clumsiness, he had almost cut down the mentor. The sword slipped from his hands and flew away. With a groan of exhaustion, he desperately increased the pace, continuing to move further and stubbornly sticking to his training plan. Younger students, confused, closely followed this marathon. They had no idea which fly had bitten their older brother. The episode started. The young man wheezed as he drew breath, tightly gripping the sword, and a stern voice immediately pierced his thoughts. Without a strong foundation of skill, you won't grow into a true master. The boy suddenly looked around sharply, holding his breath in fear. A man stepped forward and immediately warned, excessive exhaustion will only destroy the body, not help. His black cloak barely trembled in the wind. The student straightened abruptly. He had just recognized his mentor. The man quietly snorted into his fist, closely studying the soaked protege. He ordered the young man to quickly get dressed and change clothes to join the joint trip. The young man suddenly turned pale, feeling that the master had already revealed the truth about the Chagan gang and the command had just sounded destination. Songra. The student did not believe what he heard, and the mentor coldly and without hesitation repeated the name. The young man froze in place, and shock was already painting red silk curtains and golden pins of this entertainment venue in his mind. A stunned boy silently uttered the name of this place, mouthing it word by word. Before them rose the Kaisen house. Inside, musicians were humming and guests were bustling. The youth asked confusedly if it was true that his mentor had brought him here. The mentor, with a barely noticeable smile, remarked, "This boy knows too much." The apprentice uncertainly poked himself with a finger and seemed to remind. He was only 14, but the man simply burst out laughing sincerely in response. The youth flared up with indignation and broke out in sweat. Even if in this life they had grown closer, who in their right mind would go to the Kaisen house to have fun with their own teacher? The man calmly and seemingly without a second thought asked if he was not against keeping him company. The boy just resignedly lowered his head and consented without objection. A tiny moment of silence. Limping slowly through the yard, the apprentice sighed heavily each time the mentor's order was not subject to any disputes. In a completely different place, scrolls covered with writing were laid out on the table, and a female voice, tired and hoarse, spoke through a pause. This time the uncle really outdid his own capabilities. A stately beauty in luxurious attire hovered over the pile of papers, holding a pipe and lost in thought. From the darkness, an illuminated sign stood out, Songru. It was not some kind of shambles, but a real palace. It bathed in the soft, warm glow of lanterns. But despite everything, the courtesans of Songru did not sell their bodies. Their merchandise was laughter, music, and art. In the night air, crimson sparks lazily swirled. The young man blinked confusedly. Often for their remote district Anson, the establishment looked too elite. The boy was embarrassed. Coming here together with the mentor seemed not a very pleasant idea. The stern, long-haired teacher approached the owner closely and said without stopping that they had come to the lady. The woman gently and clearly showed the way. The mentor firmly moved forward and the student crouched and followed him, hiding behind his broad back. They froze opposite the closed doors, and the guide reported that guests had arrived from Songamun. In the semi-darkness, the painted lips barely moved. The mistress of the room ordered them to be let in. The guide put a polite smile into words and extended an offer to the man to drink. The mentor and the student silently moved forward, not uttering a single word. The boy, confused, suddenly exclaimed, and the man instantly stopped. The luxurious owner of Songru met them and, boldly squinting, slyly noted how this unusual couple appeared. The boy froze as if struck by electricity. In his past life, he had no idea that the mentor once had a connection to Songru, so now he still could not believe that the poor sect Songyamun was intertwined with such a luxurious house of pleasures. The young man sank into thought. Could it be that the master dragged him here every time, just from there, a pile of silver? While the boy gawked admiringly at her youthful appearance, Valhian greeted first and immediately, without hesitation, offered the mentor a job. She said with a smile that his talent was wasted, and he sharply and dryly cut off in response. He was not interested in men. The student was so confused by this bluntness that he even blushed. The hostess of the establishment momentarily, completely lost her voice. She sharply squinted, fixing her gaze on the master's sharp tongue. Suddenly, the woman burst into ringing laughter, recalling rumors that the senior student was supposedly incredibly kind. Her mocking smile dryly confirmed every word spoken. The boy's gaze darkened. For a fighter, the reputation of being kind was a stigma, and the whole town perceived him as a naive fool. Makshim firmly declared to his companion, "From now on everything will go differently." The young man immediately understood. He was brought here not for the courtesans, but suddenly the owner of the establishment playfully called Maxim uncle with a sly smile. The boy blinked confusedly and frequently. But the woman did not hesitate for a moment. She abruptly dropped the jokes and announced to the guest with cold severity that he had crossed the line. She still could not comprehend how he had, with his own hands, cut down the entire Chagan gang in just one night. Maxim calmly and without unnecessary emotion cut off the dispute with words about weighty reasons, and then the courtesan leaned closer and asked if they would continue to cover up the traces. She nervously tapped her fingers on the table, pushing the conversation, this time to spread rumors. The woman firmly said, as soon as they dare, not even half a day will pass and the whole city will reveal the truth. The night streets quickly fill with whispers and the rumor spreads the truth. The mysterious killer Siofan is Maxim. It turned out, for that destroyed gang, this order was not the first. The previous one happened many years ago, and the wife of the head of the Soan clan took part in it. It turned out that the first such order was given many years ago. Then the third wife of the head of the Soan clan, who was from the Pan family, died. Having assessed all the risks, the woman still pushed to hide the information, but Maxim categorically gave the order to spread rumors. From that sudden surprise, her gaze sharply widened as if shock had pierced to the bone. The young man burst out with a frightened exclamation just as the uncle, with full confidence, slammed the document on the table in front of the hostess. The woman only smiled slyly, and the boy stood drenched in cold sweat. She collapsed weakly into the armchair. Everything fell into place. This game was started for the sake of the little one. The young man was struck by a sudden jolt. Songru revealed itself as a true guild of informants. He clenched his head with his hands and froze, not understanding why in the past life the uncle had dragged this secret out until the very end. The young man desperately turned over reasons in his head, why the mentor in the past life kept the true essence of Songru hidden from him until the very end. The man held an impassive smile motionlessly, and the boy feverishly searched with his eyes for an explanation for this sudden frankness. A deep heavy sigh and the woman gave up. She sharply poked him with her finger. All the dealings with the Chagan gang are on her, and they divide the shares like 7 against 3. The uncle nodded indifferently and by this made it clear. It's not over yet. They will have to grease the fat pigs on their sides. The hostess sharply puffed out her cheeks, showing irritation in response to his dry thank you. Suddenly the man recoiled to the side, and all attention shifted to the nephew. Valkian, I beg you, he said, and released the boy from the grip of his gaze, causing him to blink confusedly and frequently. The woman ordered the young man not to move from his place. While it was still ongoing, the elder man silently turned around and walked away, and the boy confusedly rushed to call him from behind. The heavy door slammed shut with a loud bang and locked. Having closed the door behind everyone and left alone with the hostess, he panicked and burst into a scream. She sharply interrupted her hysterical sobbing with a single command, sit down. Hot drink poured into the clay bowl. The woman with the pipe, allowing no objections, unequivocally ordered him to drink. He nervously swallowed and listened to the words about how this place earns money by selling information. Her words cut through the smoke and her gaze fixed on me as soon as she spoke about the secrets they both had gathered. The hostess added, such information they usually give only to his mentor. An indulgent smile flashed on her face, one that left no chance for doubts or objections. And suddenly polite words of apology flew out right in front of the client. The woman leaned over him and clearly reminded him, in their craft, every secret inevitably has to be paid for. How am I supposed to pay? The boy's shoulders tensed as her sharp gaze fixed on him. She directly mocked his hopelessness, yet still broke into a smile and gave him a chance. One free question. He swallowed hard and barely audibly expressed thanks. The woman calmly leaned back and immediately a thought ran through her mind. She knew perfectly well that he was digging for the truth about her relationship with his mentor. They were bound together by an old shared wound, one that still forces them to hold on to each other. She squinted sharply and coldly asked how much he had already managed to find out. The boy revealed the whole truth, the failed scholar's exam, working for a merchant, and his past with his family. The woman caught a confirming nod about revenge and immediately felt the conversation would move much faster from here. Her face instantly went cold and became extremely serious. The trading company pulled his mentor back from the very brink of death when he was trying to escape from the burning hell. And then the woman confessed directly, she is the biological daughter of that trading lord. As soon as he heard it, the boy froze like a petrified stone. 2 men slipped out of the burning mansion. They were fleeing from the very same trading guild that once pulled their mentor back from that world. The woman declared without hesitation. She is the biological daughter of the head of that very trading guild. The young man freezes from surprise, as if struck by electricity. The puzzle picture came together now. It was clear why she called him uncle, even though there was no blood relation between them. He asked why the daughter of the guild leader would want to work in such a place, and the woman replied with a barely noticeable smile, "They went bankrupt." Again, that night flared up in her memories. Just after Uncle left, the mansion was attacked and she had to break free, literally run away, taking the guild treasury to survive, after which she doomed herself to long wanderings. She closed her eyes. Since then, she was driven forward by a single desire for revenge. Opening the Kaisen house in Anson, the woman mingled with the men so that they would talk and reveal secrets, and this time she again found their mentor. She playfully made a gesture to signal her interlocutor. He froze, captivated by each of her words, and could not recover from what he heard. The boy's thoughts stopped in the past. His mentor never revealed anything about his own history so that the students would not repeat the same joyless path and icy, pain-filled sword that wounds. The young man clenched his clothes in his fists until they cracked, and only then did it become clear why the teacher remained silent about Songru. Everything finally came together. This story was directly connected to his past. The boy leaned low over the table and sincerely thanked Mrs. Valkian for opening his eyes. The woman gently dismissed these words. It turns out, the one guilty before him was not he, but she. A warm, peaceful smile flashed across her face. She said directly that she had seen her uncle helpless all her life until Songmun came and pulled him out of trouble. Valkian stared at her reflection in the teacup and finally revealed the main secret. It was the uncle himself who gave the order to dispel the rumors. Supposedly, he alone destroyed that cruel Chagan gang. The young man felt as if struck by electricity. Doubting what he heard, he jerked sharply upward and with a loud crash slammed his hands on the table. Unconditionally believing street rumors turned out to be a gross mistake. The hostess calmly leaned back, firmly holding a cup in her hand. The puzzle finally came together. The successor of Song Gi-moon is not a fool at all. He is a mentor from Anson County who launched a large-scale game. This sharp maneuver left no room for doubt. He was going to openly challenge the entire Murim. Not long ago, the world was in decline in memory of the mentor, how exactly he once personally wiped out 5 dark sects, and this strike was meant to sharply restore everyone's awareness of his true power. She firmly said, from now on no one will dare to touch either him or the students of Songmun. Nearby, on the ground, lay the torn bodies of enemies. Such proof will await anyone who dares to go against the order and will bring upon themselves the furious wrath of her uncle. The young man grimly realized, the mentor will definitely end up trapped. Everyone who harbors malice and nurtures revenge will begin to gather all their strength to one day fight back against him. The young man swallowed his saliva convulsively and quietly burst into a curse. The woman rose from the table and cut off the conversation, feeling she had already said too much, so now she would definitely pay for it. She smiled defiantly as if she was already convinced. The boy had no more questions left. And just as she opened the window, he suddenly broke the silence and asked to answer one more question. The woman cast an icy glance over her shoulder at him. She froze in place. Leaving doubts behind, the young man stubbornly dared and directly inquired whether his mentor's revenge was really over. The woman slowly turned her whole body toward him. A predatory, self-satisfied smile flashed on her lips. "And what do you think?" she snapped boldly and fixed the boy with an icy gaze. The full moon hung soullessly over the night estate and indifferently poured light. Gasping for heavy breaths, he desperately rushed forward through the darkness, not stopping for a moment. A sharp pain seized his body, and he hunched over old wounds were still oozing blood. He clenched his teeth to a grind. Letting out a desperate scream, the boy ran again. The sources of strength were exhausted, and a bitter idea slipped into his mind. Let him just keep lying down. He cursed his own weakness to himself, and cold, sticky sweat ran down his back. Memories flashed in his head about the frequent disappearances of the mentor and about the cold woman, the one who was with him in a marriage of convenience. His leg suddenly gave way. A dull blow and he collapsed to the ground powerless. Lying on his stomach and barely exhaling, he finally gathered only one conclusion in his mind. Everything that was unnecessary disappeared. His fist, full of rage, pressed into the ground. The mentor's revenge still continues. The apprentice heavily sank to the ground and, torturing himself with words, reproached himself. Again he became a burden. Powerlessness poured out in a tear. It rolled down his cheek, and he saw how the master once again torments himself for his sake. "Mentor," the boy whispered barely audibly, as soon as he recognized the familiar figure standing by the gate. He instantly sprang to his feet and respectfully bowed. He immediately ordered to stop the exhausting training, and he warmly spread into a smile. The boy jerked confusedly with his whole body, as if he was suddenly struck by electricity. Then he sharply waved his hands and, awkwardly trying to justify himself, muttered that he was going to stop as well. Changing the subject to dinner did not work. The teacher had already eaten, so now he was gnawed by a completely different anxiety. The mentor asked with concern why he was pushing himself to exhaustion since the wounds had not yet healed, and the boy admitted he simply wanted to become stronger as quickly as possible. Staring at the sword stuck in the ground, the student made a vow in his thoughts, never again to put the master in harm's way. But the master only laughed loudly. His laughter echoed a memory of that old trouble. The teacher said in a calm voice that he should not get so worked up about all this. The man gently pressed his heavy palm to the boy's head and reminded him he also knows perfectly well how to stand up for himself. In the darkness, his voice rolled out with a question. Hadn't he seen everything with his own eyes? The mentor in the black cloak turned away and walked away, and the student behind froze confusedly, not knowing what to do. The man sharply looked back, and the smile for a moment became confident. He made it clear that his strength was undeniable. The young man smiled in response with understanding and warmth and immediately accepted the order to go rest. The teacher warned that he would leave again soon, and the boy bowed attentively. He froze in place with his head bowed. Anxiety gnawed at his mind. Would the mentor's shoulders hold when the entire bloody burden of the clan fell upon them, turning into sharp thorns? Silence. Step by step, the young man plunged into darkness, firmly promising never to become a burden again. He stood all alone in the center of the night courtyard. Blue energy burst around him in a powerful whirlwind. He was to grow in strength. The air around trembled. Behind his shoulder, a blood-stained shadow from a past life ominously unfolded, but this time he would push away from it and choose a completely different path. Sun rays calmly filtered through the leaves as he prepared to get to work. The boy sat by the stream without any anxiety and decided to start with the most ordinary laundry. His face darkened, and in his head he incessantly reproached himself, as if he had broken away from reality and started throwing dirt around for several days. He carefully unfolded the torn black fabric that had stealthily passed by the younger ones, and at that very moment the forest suddenly exploded with a loud scream. Chekhova stubbornly rushed forward, heavily, dully measuring each step, resolutely pushing ahead. The young man instantly broke out in nervous sweat and, embarrassedly searching for words, quickly excused himself, as if he had asked her to wait downstairs. The girl angrily loomed over him, her fists tightly clenched, and he immediately understood. This calm morning was over. Now the problems begin. In the morning, still very early, by the river, the girl sat next to her older brother and long held words inside, not daring to start a conversation. The girl barely held back sobbing. She, struck with words, called her older brother a fool and reproached that all his attempts to silently hide everything were in vain. The boy sharply raised his gaze and became alert. In her words he caught something heavy, as if misfortune was trailing behind them. But suddenly she froze, stunned, as if struck by an electric shock. The look at her brother revealed the truth to her. The blood on his clothes belonged not to them, but to those they considered enemies. Despair caught her throat, and she tremulously whispered that she alone was to blame for everything. The girl confessed that she had been drawn into a fight with the Chagan gang, and tears immediately flowed down her cheeks. Wiping her wet eyes, she bitterly said, it was exactly her, and because of her he, together with the mentor, ended up in the fight. Brother stood up and moved forward, then quietly uttered the name Chekhova. He carefully ran his palm over her head and silently wondered how deeply she was upset. Brother quietly and convincingly assured her he was worried only because of her fright and never once entertained the thought that she was to blame anywhere. Through tears, the little girl vehemently denied that she ever intended to just become too very insanely strong. At that very moment, a wild flame suddenly flared in his eyes. When the heat flared unexpectedly, the girl let out a comical squeal and quickly retreated in fear. The girl clung tightly to a stranger's back, and in her memory, her father flashed repeatedly. He also died because of her. Again, a bloodied body flashed before her eyes, and a burning hatred of her own helplessness instantly rose in her chest. Clenching her fists so tightly, she loudly swore she would become stronger for the sake of her mentor and brothers. No one will cry because of me anymore, the child blurted out, and the boy nodded confusedly, accepting her words. He barely moved his lips, and just then he realized why Chekhova left their school in her past life. She left because she never managed to hold and protect her native sect. Before retreating, the girl looked like an ordinary fighter. It seemed unbearable for her to watch her friends suffer, and she shielded them with herself. Suddenly Mala sharply turned around, ignited with determination, and promised to extract martial arts lessons from the mentor to defend her older brother herself in the future. In this loud, firm determination lived an ordinary, sincere child, and he could only whisper his thanks to her. The boy smiled softly and warmly. The tension vanished. He offered to help with the laundry, but the girl sharply waved him off. They sat quietly for a while longer on the rocky shore, listening to the gentle splash of the waves. The thin splash of water broke the morning silence. The boy raised the wooden sword and firmly rooted one rule in his memory: everything starts with the mood. He closed his eyes and only now realized how everyday routine can instantly turn into real muscle work. The boy, already aware of his own ineptitude, despairingly began hitting the water with a stick, while his little companion quietly sat nearby and did not utter a single word. If his thoughts can reshape everything, he will no longer waste a single moment. A sharp jerk of the hand forward. Suddenly, the young man instinctively stretched out his hand, and a shiny golden trail burst out from under the stick. He cried out in confusion. Dazzling light tears through the darkness. A powerful cross-shaped slash of energy tore the river across and shattered the stones to pieces. The girl pressed herself to the rock in fright, comically widening her eyes to the limit. As soon as the splashes settled, she jumped up sharply and enthusiastically waved her hands, imitating the roar of an explosion. The boy sat pale and stunned. While joyful shouts passed by him, he did not even hear them. His hand trembled and he stared in disbelief at this ordinary stick, suddenly realizing that just now, unintentionally, he had reproduced the legendary falling sword of heavenly will. Cold sweat appeared on his forehead. He had just unleashed the technique of the sword of heavenly will, attaching it to an ordinary laundry paddle. The boy dashed off and, cutting through the yard, rushed through space past a series of blurred silhouettes. He froze in place, convulsively and heavily swallowing air. A moment flew by. A few days passed and he still couldn't recover, sweating profusely, breaking down at the memory of his own failure. No matter how much he jerked the wooden stick in front of the astonished girl, the same miracle did not happen again. Yet throughout each daily run, his inner state noticeably shifted. His mood was already different. Chopping wood, sweeping the floor, sewing and cooking no longer seemed like a penal duty. Grabbing the handle, he finally realized every little detail of this daily chore was continuous training without breaks. Determination flashed in his eyes. He just needed to repeat these familiar movements to feel the flow again. The boot pressed dully into the ground. He suddenly rushed forward at a furious speed, feeling every muscle in his body move with flawless precision and harmony, and immediately lost his balance, clumsily stumbling on an empty, flat spot. The young man collapsed exhausted near the rock, convulsively trying to catch his breath. He again burst into running through the yard, stubbornly believing that exhausting training would once more bring his lost inspiration to the surface. Behind him came a loud thudding. A trio of younger students was flying after him with all their might, shouting encouragement to their older brother. He half whispered and warmly smiled at the child while walking further. Nothing around stopped. Everything changed without pause. Him, those children, and the entire Songjamun sect. But suddenly the whole company instantly halted. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, briefly announced a break, and finally gave the exhausted students a chance to breathe out. The young man sharply called out to one of them, "Tangoyul." The boy immediately rushed to respond. The elder asked him to substitute with sweeping, and the little one immediately nodded gladly. From the caught attention, he blushed a little. They both took up the brooms. Tangoyul had recently always stayed nearby and followed him like a tail. Everything was drawn together, and he wanted to do every little thing there. The young man slowly moved the broom back and forth and smiled because nothing pressed. It was simply pleasant to have peaceful moments next to the children from whom in a past life he had so foolishly deviated. The broom froze in his palms, and suddenly a deep realization dawned on him of how much he actually values his fellow students. He honestly said that then he was just exhausted to the limit and completely lost clarity everything, while behind him a phantom mentor was rising. The young man sharply jerked his whole body as if some signal instantly pulled him out of indifference. The young man turned back to work and slowly clenched the broom in his palms, calmly sweeping dust from the stone courtyard. He was stopped by a worried comrade who inquisitively asked if he was all right. Only a warm smile touched his face. He leaned on the broom and gave advice not to worry. A brief moment without sound. The broom again rustled evenly and methodically over the tiles. After everyone left, the young man remained alone and continued silently dragging the broom, and his face darkened again with thought. Suddenly, the young man froze in place, his face sharpened, and a bright aura began to rise from his body. He closed his eyes and let the sparkling energy pass through him. He caught every movement of his own body and felt his feet firmly rooted to the ground. The palm gripped the handle even tighter. The broom crashed into the stone with a roar, sharp blow. He suddenly opened his eyes, his pupils instantly narrowed from the unexpected flash of light. He softly waved the ordinary broom and a bright arc trail flashed in the air, as if carving a new path for a sword. Another strike cut the space with a blow that bit into it with the true power of the blade. The earth suddenly shook and a giant pillar of energy burst into the sky, hitting the young man right in the face. He did not slow down for a moment, he kept the pace steadily and continued to make his way through the whirlwind of dust. A strike with the handle sharp and heavy completely shatters the stone slabs right underfoot. The boy caught a wave of joy and stretched into a satisfied smile. Finally, he felt the true essence of his sword of heavenly will. In the dark room, there was a deaf, absolute silence. The young man collapsed weakly onto the bed, hoarsely complaining about a fierce attack of fatigue. Recently, household chores in his consciousness had tightly merged with the principles of the sword. Washing or sweeping the yard, every movement turned into continuous training, because everything suddenly came together in one chain. Mind, routine, and the honed work of the blade merged into one powerful mechanism. He evenly raised his gaze to the ceiling and suddenly understood. It is this unity that holds him as he is. At that very moment, thick streams of blue energy swirled around his body like a whirlwind. A sonorous, shining whirlwind with force tore through the roof and instantly burst into the dark night sky. Falling into the very center of this storm, the boy again saw in memories his former life there. He always felt like a stranger. A barely noticeable smile stirred on his lips, meaning real life indeed existed in the world, both at this moment and before. Suddenly the door burst open and on the threshold stood a guest frozen by surprise, calling the elder brother. Only for a moment a deaf silence fell. He touched his own stomach and there a blue whirlwind flared up. The inner energy finally returned. A barely noticeable smile flashed across his face. Before his eyes still flickered a memory, how that power shattered into pieces and he stubbornly believed he had lost it forever. Walking down the corridor alongside the younger apprentice, he was turning over in his mind his own core of power when suddenly the apprentice stopped and asked if he had accidentally grown. The young man froze in place, full of shock and surprise. An alarm flared in his head. In his past life, he was able to grow only after a whole year. The gaze slid lower and it turned out that the pants had indeed become significantly shorter. He awkwardly reached for the edge of his clothing and a suspicion stirred in his mind. This sudden transformation could have been the result of Manhwa's influence. And the boy was already eagerly tugging at his sleeve, trustingly believing that the secret to rapid growth lay in daily yard cleaning. The boy's eyes flashed with such enthusiasm that it immediately caught the eye. He resolutely clenched his fists. The boy didn't wait even a second. He rushed out of the corridor like a whirlwind to immediately grab the broom, while the young man only helplessly reached out, watching him with his gaze. A dry leaf whirled past his surprised gaze. The boy simply smiled relaxedly and waved his hand, as if it didn't concern him at all. The morning followed the same usual routine. He swept the yard, fed the children, and now was running training laps. He was breathing heavily, and sweat was streaming into his eyes. He slammed on the brakes sharply in front of the children, and they were already collapsing exhausted onto the grass. The tired girl complained, saying that today they had run much more, and the brother agreed with surprise. Wiping sweat from his forehead, he suddenly realized, behind all this stands the Manhwa technique. The young man touched the ground and immediately felt how the internal energy incessantly penetrates the chi, filling the body with boundless endurance and sharpening the senses to the edge. This power imperceptibly and continuously spun inside him, as if working by itself. A brief viscous moment without sound. Fixing his gaze on his own palms, he suddenly realized a new physical strength had pulled his body into adulthood overnight. But suddenly he caught out of the corner of his eye that Koyan was gone and just heard. The boy went to dig in the ground and immediately a familiar anxiety pricked him. He only managed to convulsively exhale from that surprise. He was completely confused. 3 students sharply turned at the shout where it sounded, "Elder brother." His eyes sharply widened. He recognized this mighty chi without hesitation. A little girl with a joyful scream rushes like a whirlwind towards him. The yard exploded with noise. Children rushed to the gates and interrupting each other against all odds greeted the mentor who was home. The young man, together with the girl, gathered their hands in a traditional, respectful gesture. Both students stretched their lips into wide smiles and did not hide how happy they were about his return. The man squeezed past them and went by. He warmly and kindly stretched a smile on his face, looking at the little ones. And then he suddenly stopped and without a word fixed his gaze on the young man. He quietly exhaled with relief, making sure that the master had returned intact without a single scratch. But as soon as the moment of silence came, he instantly tensed because the mentor broke it. "You have noticeably grown," the man said calmly. Chekva raised her gaze and met his warm but unyielding smile. The master noted her brother in an even tone, praising the exhausting training that he patiently endured. The young man bowed low and whispered words of thanks barely audibly. The boy was glowing from the long-awaited news of recognition, and then, suddenly, his sister jumped out from behind his back. She sharply and loudly demanded that she also be taken to learn martial arts. The mentor blinked confusedly very often. Not so long ago she trembled in panic at this man, but now she clenched her fists resolutely, as if ready to attack. Burning with emotions, she mentally swore to personally deal with all the enemies so that her older brother would never have to take it upon himself again. From such bloodthirsty rage, both their eyes nearly popped out of their sockets, and the young man panicked and rushed to cover her mouth. He pressed closer to the mentor's ear and, unable to find peace, whispered the solution. The master was pierced by cold sweat. He suddenly realized that during the escape the child had witnessed their cruel execution. He remained silent but firmly grabbed both children by both hands. The girl pressed her palms together and fervently begged for one thing, to make her truly strong so that she could finally protect her brother and her new teacher. The man laughed sincerely and warmly, not hiding his surprise, how quickly these children had grown. He closed his eyelids. The Sanghamun sect was supposed to be only a temporary refuge for him. His true home had forever disappeared in that bloody day among the bodies of the dead, where he sank into the whirlpool of endless revenge. For many years he allowed the current to carry him through this bloody sea, and now everything had turned upside down. He cast a glance downward at the little ones who trustingly nestled right at his feet. Now he confidently understood where his place was, and with proud zeal took upon himself the role of their mentor. Stopping at the bright smile of the senior students, the man finally dispelled all doubts. He clearly understood the duty that lay upon him and the responsibility he had for their future. Suddenly shame pierced him with cold sweat. He had personally thrown all this burden onto Li Hy's shoulders. Grasping the thought of his own worthlessness, the mentor fiercely scolded himself in his mind and without hesitation declared, "Training starts tomorrow morning." Over the wide green yard, a joyful children's shout filled with delight rolled out. In his thoughts, the mentor made a vow to himself. This time he would not let the sword slip from his hands, because these children also have the right to choose their own path. A large palm gently tousled the hair of the senior students. The little ones tightly embraced the mentor, pressing their whole bodies against him, and suddenly gave him only a gentle, cloudless smile. The man softly beamed with a smile and immediately lifted the joyful little one into his arms, aloud asking how much his main student had grown. The teacher gathered his 4 young students around a generously set table. One of the students literally froze in amazement when the mentor generously poured a full bowl of food for him. One of the boys suddenly blushed and awkwardly faltered, mumbling words of thanks. The youngest cheerfully chirped about the meat, while at that moment another student froze in amazement and stared shockingly at the mentor. The man who always seemed icy and unattainable to her suddenly reached out and placed a piece of food directly into her bowl. The boy caught himself in a sudden feeling of happiness, and the mentor promised, after the meal he would teach them secret techniques. He smiled kindly and gave free rein. They ate to their fill, without any restrictions. The children eagerly pounced on the treat. The moment of satiety was cut short by hard work. Tangoyul and Chekwa had already started training. The mentor crossed his arms behind his back and closely watched as they meditated. While the children's bodies had not yet strengthened, they had to start with exhausting internal techniques from which sweat streamed down them. As soon as the saving signal "end for today" sounded, the students collapsed exhausted onto the grass. But even when they had no strength left, they stubbornly insisted they would manage and never give up. The mentor gave the students a command to go rest in an even tone. They bowed respectfully. While everyone else hurried to scatter, the young man stubbornly remained standing in place. The teacher handed the boy a sword and briefly, without unnecessary words, asked if he was ready. The boy tightly clenched the scabbard. He confidently stretched a smile. Stepping back into a combat position, the young man suddenly felt a wave of excitement wash over him completely. The mentor did not take his eyes off him. Inflate your lungs with air. His memory suddenly grabbed a phrase he had already heard twice in past lives. He has no talent at all. A bitter memory flashed before his eyes, again the same cold verdict that was announced to him, recognizing him as completely talentless. He slowly drew the blade, and if that was true, then it meant striking the teacher made no sense at all. Inside the frame, a whirlwind of blue energy burst, and the boy froze in stance, ready to demonstrate everything he was capable of. The man suddenly shuddered. In this movement, he recognized his own sword. The young man struck the golden flash with all his life experience. The blow revealed the true power of the sword of heavenly will. The blade trembled sharply. The technique had not yet had time to properly work out. He gripped the hilt so tightly that his knuckles turned white and forcibly restrained the weapon. He stubbornly took a firm step forward. The fear of mistakes no longer held him back. Even if he was imperfect, the technique created in 10 days burst out with complete destruction. A gigantic wave of energy tore through the air and, with a continuous roar, smashed into the ground with full force. The boy abruptly paused and, greedily gulping air with his mouth, held his breath in bursts. Cold sweat ran down his face as he exhaled with relief and breathed out the thought, "It's all finally over." Sudden footsteps made him instantly turn around. A grim mentor stood frozen right in front of him. The man said coldly, as if he had no talent at all, but the young man stubbornly decided not to let this knock him off track. Only upon hearing the usual continuation of the phrase did he feel a calm, quiet smile spread across his face. The old man had indeed recognized his gift. Lee Hwi froze in place from shock, and a drop of sweat slowly slid down his cheek. The man opposite did not look away. He only smoothed into a confident smile and again emphasized that the young man truly had talent. Hwi involuntarily shuddered and withdrew in confusion, pushing away the very thought that it could be true. In response to why the mentor would lie, the student said that he himself had made a lot of mistakes and constantly lost his balance. The trembling of the sword in his hands, like a memory that would not let him rest, only added to his confidence. He was truly talentless. The swordsman listened to all those excuses, then called him by name in an even tone. He slowly moved forward and addressed Lee Hwi with a question. What exactly does he call talent? The young man faltered in confusion. People again and again argue about the volume or depth of some vessel, but the elder only said, "These are just different words." Is talent merely being born with a legendary body and insane strength? The advantage is either in how easily he takes up the blade after just 2 swings, or in how lightning fast his sharp analytical mind works. The man narrowed his eyes and directly asked whether the ability to remember literally everything at first glance is considered a talent. Khvi blinked sharply and his interlocutor smiled gently. Yes, there are talents, but still, there is something more significant. Suddenly, the mentor snatched his hand from the movement and confidently, firmly said, "That is also a talent." Hard calluses appeared on the palm, rubbed to the point of bleeding, painfully catching the eye. The man smiled softly, and at that moment, his tireless labor surfaced. The boy was confused. Mere efforts turned out to be insufficient for him. But the teacher did not yield his position. The boy knew how to forge his own path. Before him stood one who knows how to find his own true answer. Without rocket speeds and without loud records, his persistence kept him at the distance longer than anyone, and that is the very true mastery for which he was famous. The boy's eyes instantly filled with tears. The teacher kindly tousled his hair in response to sincere gratitude. The young man tightly clasped the clothes on his chest with his palms and suddenly realized his whole life revolved around one goal: to gain recognition from the mentor. The single simple "well done" is all he had longed to hear. The teacher gave him a parting order to go his own way and not be afraid to try new attempts. And he himself promised to stay aside and at the right moment definitely come to help. The boy bowed almost to the ground to the mentor and whispered his thanks. The man calmly asked what exactly he had finally understood. Gathering his thoughts together, the student firmly voiced the answer. Now he clearly sees the hidden connection that unites everything in the world. The mentor smiled warmly and approvingly, letting the student understand he had finally taken the right path. But suddenly the mentor smiled slyly and a powerful battle cry burst from his lips. 3 younger schoolchildren froze in complete silent stupor. They looked confusedly at their older brother, who stood alone near the distant wall. With a sharp scream, the boy rushed forward. The boot crashed to the ground with a deafening roar and scattered dust to the sides. But in a moment he jerked on the brakes, exhaled sharply, and howled in disappointment. Nothing worked out again. The younger ones helplessly whispered to each other and darted glances, not understanding why he was practicing this strange, sharp, fast step to complete exhaustion. Sweating profusely, the boy stubbornly found his starting position and pressed into it again. He could only marvel, how would he manage the whole yard in a single burst? Breaking into sharp cry, he rushed forward. The couple with the child standing opposite froze in confusion and could not understand what exactly was happening. The little one called the mentor loudly and ran straight to him. The man instinctively, as if thoughtlessly, held the child close while she poured out frightened complaints about her scary older brother in a trembling voice. Another little one also raised a complaint and amusingly pointed a finger. The master snorted uncertainly and confusedly. He fixed his gaze intently on KHVI and clarified what he had decided to show this time. The boy jerked forward sharply and with one sword strike cut the air with a crunch. The mentor involuntarily froze in surprise because the student, instead of a strike, suddenly whimpered despairingly with his own helplessness. HWI grabs his head and completely loses control over his movements. He involuntarily tensed up, as he did even before the strike began to approach. As soon as the boy came to his senses, he quickly and hastily bowed, and the mentor calmly asked why he froze right in front of the wall. HWI twitched and nervously fell silent. In a past life, he really was part of Murim, but he never grew into a warrior. Everything ended with a hard blow to the head that finished him off. That time he taught no one. Instead, he himself kept getting lessons, very painful ones, straight to the nuts. The boy took a deep breath and honestly admitted, endless fast-step training finally led him to a truly important discovery. The mentor nodded briefly, reservedly, and without unnecessary words. Somewhat bored, the student said that all this time he was puzzling over how to dodge a strike using only one movement. A battle was already raging in his mind. The correct step into the gap in distance made the enemy blade miss and vanish into emptiness, and a sharp step forward immediately triggered a lightning-fast defense. The advance or retreat was decided by one thing: the speed at which the legs moved. To strike first, to block the move first, to slip away first. The boy confidently spread into a smile. If he did not earn the title of Grandmaster, he would perfectly bring to perfection only what he truly knew. The man warmed up from this warm look and stubbornly accepted the challenge, directing all his zeal at him. He solemnly placed his heavy palm on the student's head, and the latter immediately blazed with joy. The boy burst into a smile and cheerfully exclaimed that he agreed. But as soon as the mentor gathered his thoughts, his face sharply lost color, and he said without joking that he had to announce one more important thing. In a few days, they were expecting a general meeting. The circle man with a thick beard stared heavily straight ahead. The students were surprised by the news of the unscheduled meeting. Previously, they met only once a quarter. The man stated that the leadership had again started talking about unity. The young man put the puzzle together in a moment. The Chagan gang had disappeared overnight without a trace. The air in Anson crackled with the hum of rumors. They say it was the mentor's doing. He personally gave the order to clear the territory. Tension tightened the boy's face like a spasm. After they witnessed real combat power with their own eyes, former allies suddenly started talking about friendship, although after the death of the previous leader, they had cut all ties without hesitation. He wearily ran his fingers over his temple. The foreign intentions were too obvious. They could be read immediately. But the decisive push came from the elders' demands. The young man also had to come to the meeting. He stunnedly poked a finger at his own body. The day came when everyone goes out to gather. The young man nervously rattled his steps down the corridor. He only wanted to look after the younger ones, not get involved in politics. Pushing aside the hall door, he immediately understood everything. Everyone just wanted to stare at the very same student for whom the Sanan's sword had wiped out an entire gang. But he did not plan to expose himself, and he simply had nothing to do it with. The young man sharply and cautiously turned his head. A suffocating silence hung in the air, and everyone swallowed the tension. What exactly are they even doing there? In the depths of the room, three conspirators pressed close to each other, gathered into a tight pile and whispered about the promised treats. The woman kindled curiosity with the shadow of mysterious tales, but now she bluntly hinted she really wanted to go with the older brother. The girl slyly stretched her lips into a smile as soon as she listened to those strange conversations, and nearby, from around the corner, they were being closely watched. A sharp movement interrupted the thought of simply asking the mentor. The woman sprang from her place and abruptly stood up, as if struck by a new idea. She feverishly whispered her plan into the little one's ear, and the latter, with a cunning encouragement, nudged herself with a finger. Next to him, the young man suddenly blushed all the way to the tips of his ears and opened his mouth wide. Overwhelmed with emotions, he blurted out that their second older brother was the coolest, and didn't even notice how that same brother, with a confused expression, froze puzzled on the threshold. Determination flashed in his gaze, and immediately a loud order to act thundered. The company was already on alert, about to burst from their place at any moment. Meanwhile, the second brother anxiously pressed against the doorframe, cold sweat breaking out. Thoughts about what they had started gave him no peace. Suddenly, the silence of the corridor was cut by heavy, even steps of a burly man in black. The teacher sharply raised his eyebrows in embarrassment and frowned. A trio of students suddenly stepped forward and took battle stances right in front of him. They did not rush into battle, they only started waving their hands, begging, "Take them with you to the meeting." Fists clenched tightly because anxiety overwhelms. Indescribably desperate, and at the same time cloying pleas poured out one after another. One of the boys caught the mood of heavy artillism, a puppy-like lack of audacity in his gaze and a thick blush on his cheeks. He literally glowed from his own charm, and the other children enthusiastically encouraged him from the side. The master sharply jerked back and turned pale from shock. Tangoyul. A tear of fear slid down his stern face from what he saw, while the children cheerfully reached out demanding, "Continue." The young man finished him off completely and, as if playing, coquettishly pointed a finger to his own cheek against the backdrop of blooming roses. Finally, the mentor eased the tension and, as if resignedly patted his triumphant students on the heads. The girl smiled radiantly and asked the boy to follow her. At these words, he immediately blushed deeply and turned bright red. Just as this happened, a sharp, loud children's cry about the older brother sounded. The boy burst into a panic scream, while she awkwardly, as if helplessly, continued to laugh. The little one, not wasting a second, whined in a race and shouted calls so that the older brother would move faster. The young man confusedly pressed his head with his fingers, unable to endure their incessant shouting. She traced her eyes across the cloudless sky, and at that moment a thought flashed in her head. This had happened for the first time in both her lives. Finally, their whole family gathered in one frame, carefree smiling children in front and a burly man standing behind. They all together moved forward in unison, as if they had finally gotten a chance to go somewhere together. The Changhyun clan concentrated full power in Ansan County as the wealthiest house among martial arts masters. A little boy from the arriving group excitedly opened his mouth wide and stared at the vast domains, as if looking at a miracle. Excitement sparkled in his eyes. The owners were valued not only for their gold. Ordinary landowners over time carved out a mighty clan for themselves. Generation after generation, they accumulated colossal wealth and united strong ties. Rumors went, their influence had long crossed the county borders and had already reached even the upper echelons of the Yuden sect. Stained glass and the faces of guests froze before the grand multi-tiered building, from which a joyful greeting was already spreading. The patriarch of the clan himself opened the door to meet them, Changhyun Gon, who stood forward with a friendly, warm smile. He burst out laughing sincerely as soon as their gazes crossed with the tall leader of the guests, and then mentally noted how strikingly he had changed. Nearby, the gang leader Chagan, bristling with tension, stopped and received a quiet order from the patriarch to keep himself in check. The patriarch greeted the arrivals with a sweet smile, while the dark-haired youth simmered quietly, was annoyed that the adults interfered in the usual children's quarrels. He cast a heavy, cutting glance at him. Changhyun Gon responded with an impassive nod. The youth stepped forward together with his team, firmly understanding. At this moment, under no circumstances could they make new enemies. The gray-haired elder waved his hand as if to say, "It's nothing serious," and went up the stairs. The gray-haired man waved hospitably to everyone and invited them to enter the pavilion. The others silently moved from their places and followed. Right by the very gate of the pavilion, a foreign voice intercepted them with apologies for being late. On the stairs appeared the burly patriarch Changhyun. He grumbled discontentedly that all this was already 100 times too much for him, but as soon as he appeared, the gray-haired man immediately blossomed with a smile and began showering them with courtesies, assuring that the guests had arrived just on time. Lee Hwi kept a cool head and watched this theater closely. He perfectly understood that the enmity from a past life had not disappeared anywhere. Before the eyes, a terrifying flash burst forth and memories broke out, scorching ruins and bloody shocks that very soon will again fall upon this world. To stay alive, 4 great sects will have to gather together and create one monolithic alliance. But first, it was necessary to closely attend to urgent matters. A command sounded to greet the leaders gathered here. Lee Hwi sharply raised his gaze and stubbornly stared ahead. He stepped forward, folded his palms in a bow, and loudly apologized for past troubles, introducing himself as the first disciple of Sanghamun. Now it was time to cleanse his own reputation. The boy straightened up exactly, composedly, and respectfully, without the slightest hint of a servile tone, only cold, calm confidence. The gray-haired leader blinked so sharply from surprise, as if he could not at all expect such calm composure from the boy. His smile barely touched his lips. The simple and good-natured first disciple was no more. Now he would make everyone treat him with respect even when the mentor was no longer nearby. The juniors interrupted his thoughts. Tangoyul and Chekva nodded reservedly and respectfully in response, while little Hokkien, smiling, spread his arms wide right towards him. Meanwhile outside, the elders were negotiating, quietly exchanging words. The black-haired man waved his hand as if to say the boy was nowhere near perfect, yet then suddenly sharply shifted the conversation to a different tone. The man abruptly stopped the general noise, loudly declaring that it was time to move on to the main point. Resounding applause in the palms. The gray elder solemnly and clearly proclaimed the official start of the meeting. Laughter spread over the majestic multi-tiered pavilion. Cheerful chatter filled the entire courtyard. Inside the building, the languid Hoyan exhaled contentedly after lunch, which took his breath away with its taste. Someone gently handed a napkin right to his smeared face. The young man with a gentle smile carefully wiped the child's cheeks. Yes, a bright joyful exclamation flew. Dehan gloomily calculated what gave him a chance. In the past life, the Changhean clan fell apart by its own forces, and the enemies only completed what was left. Ancient conversations of the elders flashed in his mind about how the current patriarch brings destruction. He had no idea how to save the situation and stop this catastrophe, being only an ordinary disciple of another sect. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a loud children's shout. The girl nearby instantly twitched and jumped up. The boy shortened the distance and, gathering his courage, solemnly named himself Changhyun Sohan, although he was only 5 years old. In response, the girl proudly stretched her smile and boasted. She said she was about to turn 6. She literally blazed with her own significance. Sohan's eyes flared with fire. He clenched his fists tightly and openly envied such an already grown-up age. Dehan calmly interrupted the conversation and directed a brief remark at the little one. His time was not far off either. The children immediately understood each other, and laughter washed over them all like a wave. It took them only a few seconds to find a common language and make friends. Feeling that he was already outside the group, the young man awkwardly named his own name, and the girl immediately sharply clarified how old he was. He suddenly blushed and made a proposal, friendship on the terms of a 10-year older brother, but Sohan responded to him only with a heavy, silent look. What a child! Lee Hwi got bored and propped his cheek with his palm, recalling those funny childish courtships and promises to give all the toys. During lunch, the same familiar girl in a green robe approached him again. Once in a past life, he had also relentlessly chased after a girl named Chekwa. The boy did not stop talking. He invited to ride a boat and boasted about overseas decorations that he specially bought for his birthday. Lee Hwi barely twisted into a smile. Only in his thoughts he clearly remembered how this loser suitor was devastated and crawled on his knees after she left the sect. Suddenly he sharply shifted his gaze to the door. A young man with a sword in his hands timidly squeezed into the hall, wiping the sweat that was rolling off him convulsively. Lee Hwi recognized at first glance the sect's disciple and the eldest son of the leader Changhyun Taehan, after which he calmly stated his name in greeting. In my memory, the majestic image of this boy appeared next to the stern clan leader. In those years, everyone predicted incredible potential for Taehan. The new acquaintance, as if to an old friend, grabbed Lee Hwi by the hands and with a smile declared, "Their father considers them peers, though he himself did not yet realize what dark fame he would bring them in the future." Later he would be called the first of the 3 heroes of Changhyun, a rake who would drown in the cup and in the arms of women, and at the same time drag his clan to self-destruction. Meanwhile, Taehan laughed heartily and talked incessantly about his father, and Lee Hwi was only surprised by his naive straightforwardness. Lee Hwi said evenly that he and his father seemed to be very close, and covered his true thoughts with a light smile. In their former life, Changhan Gon and Changhan Tehin fiercely hated each other, and family affairs were rapidly sinking to the very bottom. The patriarch and the heir were already quarreling so much that their relationship barely held, so they did not withstand the attack of the Chagan gang, and yet even now peace still held between them. So why did their clan still die out? He suddenly grabbed his head as if it was tearing from the inside. Interference in another family turned out to be too deep, and he could not imagine what he could even change. The heir lightly, a little awkwardly, ran his fingers through his own hair and, warming with a smile, admitted, "It is very difficult here to find peers for a normal conversation." After all, the children of the patriarch of the Changhan clan almost never managed to find a person with whom they could talk so easily and casually. He kept a sharp gaze on the boy, never finding an answer to how this person became a hopeless scoundrel in the future. Suddenly the heir twitched in fear. "Doesn't it smell like sweat from me?" he blurted out, and he made his interlocutor recoil in fear and wave his hands frantically. When he was refused, the boy ran his hand over his forehead with relief and admitted that this was exactly why he panicked. Now the elder of the Wudin sect was visiting them. The father cherished great hopes. The son was supposed to catch the attention of this respected guest. The heir cherished the dream of becoming an ordinary secular student for at least a moment, so he ran here, fleeing from exhausting training, and as soon as he said this, his interlocutor instantly froze. The memory flashed with a sharp blow to the brain, and he caught everything in his memory without exception. He darted back over his shoulder, sharply turned around, and jumped back from the dazzling flash of light. Bare feet tore into the void. This fall forever altered his path and became the reason why Changhyun Tihin turned onto a crooked trail. The screen was covered in complete darkness. The perfect Mu Ak sat motionless in meditation, and through the calm flowed a mystical purple yin-yang aura. The most outstanding grandmaster of Murim hovered above the crowd like an impregnable mountain. Rumors spread once he taught and led the strongest into battle. Whispers circulated. Among his students was supposedly the head of the Yudin school, a man who by his early 40s was distinguished by nothing special. The boy with a sword at his waist froze in confusion and tried to recall one important detail. The boy with a sword at his waist kept his face calm, thoughtfully weighing his thoughts. 20 years had passed since Mu Ak stopped giving advice to anyone. But the memory from his past life presented a completely different recollection. Back then, the Changhyun clan squandered all their savings and connections to secure an invitation for the master. The lord of the trading district, Changhyun Gon, then froze with proud arrogance on his face. Having decided in advance that he himself was ordinary, he stubbornly relied on the talent of his son Tihin being enough to attract the perfect's attention. But Mu Ak did not even glance at the youth nor say a single piece of advice. He immediately scattered the clan's wealth as if the wind had blown it away. That day, a real rift broke out between father and son. Changhyun Gon harbored a sickly inferiority complex that ate him from the inside. He never managed to accept his own weakness, because his own combat techniques came to him too weakly. The master became harsher with every minute. He pushed the students to bloody vomiting. Unable to withstand this pressure, the children finally broke and went astray. They squandered the fortune and raised a worthless heir, and that was enough for the Changhyun clan to collapse overnight. The Chagan gang mercilessly smashed it. The young man realized this. First and foremost, he had to worry about his own safety, but for the sake of the mentor and brothers, he had to stop the destruction of the local schools. And so the boy, an ordinary student, was simply unable to make the Changhyun heir save money, so he awkwardly, as he could, just said goodbye. Gon asked confusedly when he started twitching his hand out of fear, as if the master would suddenly be watching, and added that he needed to return to training immediately. But the heir stopped him on the spot and said directly that he came here exclusively for him. He longed to see with his own eyes the student whom the renowned sword intended to protect so highly that it could mercilessly wipe an entire school off the face of the earth. The young man clenched his jaws until it hurt. He alone held the future in his mind, for he had already managed to return from the dead. At that moment, he fixed his gaze on Gon's bright eyes and could not bring himself to utter the terrible truth. No matter how much Gon trained, he would not move from his place and would achieve no result, absolutely nothing. The young man immediately agreed with a gentle smile. Watching attentively the bustling younger students, he exhaled noticeably through his teeth, recalling the strict rules in the family, and said goodbye to Lee Hwi. He sharply turned around and walked away. Lee Hwi watched him go and could not get rid of the thoughts. Is it really destined that the two cannot break free and achieve nothing? He tightly gripped the handle of the fan and broke the silence with a sharp call to his friend. He caught the gaze and confusedly turned back. Lee Hwi sharply stretched out his hand forward towards her. He persistently insisted on joint training. Fist pressed against fist. Janghan Tihin, far stronger in abilities than him, still had a real chance to turn the course of events. In the frozen, quiet courtyard, the elders gathered and harshly discussed troubling news. The Savan clan was allegedly recruiting wandering warriors en masse due to a local conflict. A bearded man drained his cup, nibbling on the bluff himself, and said, "For petty enmity, such an army should not have been needed at all." The gloomy masters from other stalls listened silently. The dark cup hung motionless in the hand. The picture of the world of martial arts was rapidly collapsing into complete chaos. The gray-haired elder called out to those present, "Stick together in these troubled times," while the black-haired warrior silently sipped tea. He fixed the speaker with a squinting gaze. The intuition did not betray. Before him sat a true absolute master. But why had the mighty Taoist from the Wuding clan appeared here? The man in the green robe led the elder to those present. Before them stood the famous Muak, who had come only to observe their gathering. The black-haired man stretched his lips into a restrained, polite smile and swallowed the words as if calling his acquaintance truly a great honor. The silver-haired Yu Hyunjun, whose title is Sword That Pierces the Clouds, also joined in the flattery addressed to the Grandmaster. The warrior in crimson rejoiced in honor of his path, ready to accept such a legend, while the meeting organizer modestly deflected questions with jokes. When the meeting came to an end, Mu Aku quietly invited everyone to go rest, and Mu Aku immediately agreed without any hesitation. The elder silently closed his eyes and froze, as if preparing to bow. Mun Ak quietly stood up and got ready to head to the exit. 5 masters stubbornly remained seated at the round table in the sunlit gazebo. The black-haired man sipped tea again and still could not move his thoughts. Why did the great Taoist have to travel all the way to Ansinhyun for these minor gatherings? The old Taoist in white attire stood straight and calmly before the carved gate. Left alone, the old Taoist suddenly twisted his face sharply and irritably. Suddenly, he stomped his foot sharply in displeasure, and all traces of the noble sage image flew off him. The man exhaled heavily, as if gathering strength within himself. He ran his fingers over his chest and honestly admitted to himself. He fled here because he was sick of the strict rules and this tiptoe life. When he sporadically left Mount Wuding, the outside world always seemed extremely uncomfortable to him. Silence descends like a heavy curtain. A battle cry exploded in a secret, and the elder instantly twitched, sharply turning around. At home, those training shouts drove him mad, but here suddenly they caught the mood. Intrigued, he sharply moved forward with a quick step toward that noise. In the yard, a young man in green gear cut through the air with a fierce cry, wielding a wooden sword. The Taoist confidently settled down, comfortably leaning on the railing, and with lively interest fixed his gaze on the boy's movements. The old man immediately recognized in him the eldest son of the clan leader, the very Changhan Thehan. The gray-haired master watched without haste as the young man in the yard practiced the basic sword technique of the Wuding school. He ironically twisted a smile. The boy brazenly appropriated the style of his clan and stubbornly continued swinging a foreign sword. "Are you intending to take me as a student, or do you just want to get a free piece of advice?" The young man sharply sliced through the air. The blade left a red trail behind. The goal was already obvious, but the old man was suddenly overwhelmed by a complete feeling of boredom. His gaze showed no emotion, coldly remaining indifferent. From this ordinary sword, Sachin was already nauseated to despair. The jerks came out smooth and flawless, but still empty, no different from thousands of movements of other beginners. He was already about to leave, but suddenly squinted slightly caught voices. A girl appears in the yard, and she immediately clings to the boy with continuous questions about his experience. The young man shyly ran his fingers over the back of his head and admitted that he had been training for only 3 months, and the girl instantly froze in shock, as if struck by electricity. Cold sweat suddenly appeared on her body. In her previous life, she had spent 3 months only to memorize the stances firmly. While the boy naively complained about his own clumsiness and that his father had set too high expectations, she writhed in her thoughts with black envy. The dark-haired young man fervently convinced Thehan, lecturing with a finger raised high. The boy exhaled deeply and thanked sincerely from the heart. Thehan again sincerely and touchingly thanked for that unexpected support. Thehan revealed a broad smile, and the mentor honestly admitted, with such talent, Janghan Gon could dare to bet on absolutely everyone. He lightly pushed the boy aside with a smile. His pace was so crazy that there was nothing more to add. Holding Tikahin by the shoulder with a firm grip, he gave the order, "Go further without hesitation, on your own path." A wide, sincere smile and a thumb raised up. Dead silence. Tikahin froze in place like a stone, and the very thought of breaking away from the father's path and building his own frankly confused him. Without waiting for an answer, the young man lazily waved his hand in farewell and went to his training. He slowly walked across the square, unaware that someone was closely watching him from behind. A gray old man with thick mustaches snorted confusedly. "Look at this kid," he muttered, and sudden interest did not have time to hide. Lee Hwi closed his eyes, and concentrated pale blue energy wove around him in a dense glow. At the sharp scream, he suddenly stared wide-eyed, tensing up. With a jerk, he sprang from his place and with one leap cut through the air. The old master together with Lee Hwi's companion both stood amazed, not taking their eyes off. As soon as he lost control, the boy senselessly stumbled mid-flight and froze, stunned by what he himself was capable of. He hit the ground running. The body stretched heavily across the yard and with a crack struck its head against a wooden pillar. A comrade panicked and rushed to him, while Lee Hwi, with a huge smoking lump, simply muttered through his teeth that something bad had happened. When asked what had just happened, he embarrassedly rubbed the back of his head. The old master admired and lingered on the thought of what an interesting young man he was. Lee Hwi desperately joked and denied about his training, but the old man clearly saw the truth. His bones and muscles no longer held together at all. In the entire Yuden sect, there was no bigger failure than him. Talent simply never worked out. The master thoughtfully ran his fingers through his beard, shaking it and trying to understand that strange method. Heavy footsteps thundered so loudly that the young man with the sword and his companion sharply tensed with caution and slowly turned toward the stranger's voice. Before them stood a gray-haired man with his hair tied in a bun. He concealed true power with a light, almost gentle smile. The girl tensed her whole body sharply when he calmly and evenly said that the hidden presence was betrayed by the circulation of the aura of 10,000 seas. The elder slowly, without haste, moved straight towards them. The young man was covered in cold sweat. He did not even notice any wavering in the energy as this master approached him. This terrified the girl to death. The guest looked like a living person, so there should have been no shadow ghost there. After Changhyun instantly calculated the balance of power, he immediately folded his hands in a respectful bow and greeted the perfect one. The girl twitched as soon as she heard this title. She instantly pierced with her gaze his Taoist attire. It strikingly stood out from the manner held by the Dawn faction. Only one Taoist could stand at this gathering in such attire, and from then on there were no doubts left. Lee Hwi sharply, hastily raised her hands for a greeting gesture. She bowed low before the perfect Muak, who with a warm smile quickly recognized her as a sword disciple Sanan from the Sanghamun school. Changhyun quietly nudged his partner on the shoulder, turning her confusion into a brief, forced confirming yes. The boy nervously clenched the clothes in his hands and fussily excused himself, saying he was only practicing ordinary walking. The elder asked confusedly again, and the hero at that moment realized. Before him stood an influential figure he had not encountered even in his past life. He immediately realized, this man is a chance to save the Changhyun family, so without hesitation he declared that he had perfected only one quick step forward. He needed to make a good impression at all costs, so the hero stubbornly said, "A single swift move can decide the fight." While the old man faltered and blinked, the young man calmly finished his thought. A lunge forward gives the chance to strike first. A timely step back deflects the enemy blade's strike and saves you. The fighters simultaneously attacked the opponent from different sides, using the advantage of number. The old monk smiled broadly and lit up with joy. He grasped the idea of striking first and never taking a hit. He was openly amused by such bluntness, despite both young men standing there confused and not knowing what to do. The man's gaze sharpened sharply. He looked into the distance and told himself that the main goal of any martial art is to preserve one's own body. He praised the hero for realizing this truth early, then sharply cast a piercing glance to the side like a blade. The hint was deadly accurate. The fair-haired student nearby immediately broke out in a cold sweat and instantly understood exactly who was meant. Lee Hwi respectfully thanked for the high praise. He bowed almost to the ground to the master, while his companions silently froze nearby. The young man's heart pounded from the very fact of recognition by such a respected elder, but he immediately pushed these feelings away. He pointed a finger at his companion and declared that the credit for the victory was also his. The boy admitted enlightenment came to him only after carefully observing his friend's training. The companion nervously broke out in sweat as soon as the master suddenly paused for a moment and thoughtfully asked the name Li Hwi. The elder made a short forced pause and studied the interlocutors intently, without averting his gaze. He calmly, without hesitation, admitted. The young man's reasoning caught his attention and seemed incredibly interesting. The master barely smiled and without unnecessary detours offered him to become his student. The boys froze, stunned to the extreme. Li Hwi blinked confusedly, but the elder calmly finished him off with one phrase. The current head of the Yuden sect is his martial grandson. It is simple to connect this crazy chain of power. The young man, becoming the student of this old man, turns the powerful sect leader into his martial nephew. The master with a smile described to him unprecedented influence in Yuden, while the boy panicked, turning over in his head only one thought: why was such an offer given at all? The young man exhaled abruptly. A nervous sigh pierced the silence, and in his thoughts he begged, let them notice not him, but someone else. Next to him, his companion waited tensely and motionlessly for an answer. But the path was blocked by a tall, gray-haired elder. The boy confusedly uttered his name, Perfect Muakam. The young man's eyes suddenly opened wide with fear. The elder fiercely swung his sword, but just between his strike and the frightened boy, a figure in black flashed with lightning speed. In the darkness, a crimson eye flashed and an icy voice growled, "What are you doing to my student?" The young man froze, recognizing with his gaze his mentor. He became a shield for him and aimed the blade directly at the enemy. Muak only slyly twisted into a smile, as if truly surprised by how his own sword trembled. Rage covered the mentor's face, and he, clanging his voice like metal, again harshly demanded an answer. The Grey Master suddenly felt a dreadful thirst for murder, and right before him grew a real bloodthirsty demon. Muak's body suddenly flared with powerful blue-green energy. In panic, the student lunged with his hand to his head and finally understood. His teacher really plans to kill the perfect one. In the yard, right in the middle of the driveway, two huge auras collided, light and dark, on the eve of the inevitable battle. The title of the story suddenly flashed on the screen. The names of the creators flashed by. A stern man hanging in the darkness directed a mentoring look at the little girl and said that she did not necessarily have to become the best. He sharply raised his finger and ordered in a firm voice, "The main thing is to never stop, because if idle, they will begin to rot." This naive faith once raised the small landowners of Changhyun so that they could carve out a piece of land in the harsh world of Murim. Many years passed, and the grown-up girl was fiercely slashing the air with a heavy sword. Yet a few generations ago, the clan affairs of this branch were cut off. Development completely froze. She screamed hoarsely from piercing pain and immediately hunched over. The weapon landed on the stone with a dull thud. The girl greedily gulped air, and sweat streamed down her face like a river. The Changhyun family. Proud Murim family. Her palms, tiredly warmed by exhausting training, now tremble from complete bloody destruction. In Murim, any clan could grow only thanks to one thing. On the battle sword. Leader of the sword. The gray-haired man froze with silent horror and stared at his bloodied palms. And for several generations in a row, the power of their leaders stopped at a dead point. Everything changed as soon as the eldest son, Changhyun Tihan, grew up. The young man cut the air with the sword so sharply that the blade was audible. He wanted everything to glorify his family far beyond their native county. The clan gathered rare elixirs from all corners and hired famous mentors for him. The elders during the festival claimed that these potions could awaken the boy's innate talent. Most of all, they relied too much on Perfect Muaka, the very one who could be lured out only at the cost of all the connections and wealth of the entire clan. A bloody glow flared in the void as a dark silhouette sharply seized the moment and delivered a devastating blow. In panic, he suddenly clasped his head with his hands, tears splashed from his eyes, and he screamed in madness, completely losing himself in what was happening around. The young man panicked and grabbed his head. His mentor looked fully intent on killing Muaka. Two met in the square. An old man in white emitted a ghostly greenish glow, while his opponent, emerging from a black aura, only revealed his malicious grimace. The old man smiled and admitted he had seen many demons, but standing next to this swordsman, they all looked like saints. The young man shuddered sharply, frightened by the very thought of inevitable murder, and then suddenly an unexpected phrase sounded, "Let the apprentice make the decision himself." He looked confusedly at both masters at once. The man in black boldly threw confident words and smugly believed the boy would undoubtedly agree. An awkward question hung in the air like a heavy stone and would not fall. The boy froze in place and hid his gaze. He had to choose between the prestigious Yuden clan and his current mentor. Sharp observers around did not hesitate. To refuse Udana was simply impossible. Moreover, the very status of Muaki's disciple automatically elevated this boy at least to the level of a senior, even compared to the sect leader. In the most direct, literal sense, the imagination was already painting the scene. Respected elders respectfully bowed their heads before him. In a word, and he would instantly take from Murami everything they could only dream of there. The man in green froze in surprise because the young man categorically rejected his offer without any immediate agreement. 3 witnesses of that conversation almost choked with indignation and collectively covered him with curses, calling him an idiot. The mustached elder freezes, shock stiffens his face, and he asks aloud again, did he perhaps imagine it? A stifling silence hung in the spacious courtyard, and as soon as it melted away, the master nevertheless stood up on demand and asked to name what exactly was the reason for such audacity. He furrowed his brows and, sinking into thought, slowly rubbed his chin. The young man's gaze remained sharp, firm, and fully focused. The boy stated in an even tone that he did not want to endure continuous vigilant attention to his own person. His face remained completely impassive. From that frankness, a cold sweat immediately broke out on the old man. The young man added further, if he agrees to the proposal, the adult disciples of the Yuden sect will suddenly have a leader significantly younger than all of them. Moreover, the elder has never taken disciples before, so the novice will be expected to do the unthinkable, and the chances of shattering everyone's hopes are hardly low. The master silently frowned and swallowed every spoken word as if it were unbearably heavy. The young man with the sword twitched the corner of his lips and smiled nervously, as if trying to ask again whether he really fears external pressure. The warrior with a scar on his forehead nodded grimly. Even if he fulfills all expectations, this burden will not recede. Meanwhile, the man in the background was convulsively clutching his head, having mercilessly missed the chance, and the boy suddenly laughed. He turned sharply and, not hiding his sincerity, nodded. There is nothing worse than living under others' gazes. A brief pause hung in the air. The young man smiled warmly, and this made the interlocutor sharply wary. He casually threw out a phrase that, despite his appearance, he cooks quite confidently and skillfully. After this, he enthusiastically caught fire and suggested to the master to join their sect as a guest. A barely noticeable smile flashed for a moment on the stern face of Li Hy. In this quiet room, the fighter with a completely different appearance slowly unrolled the scrolls and carefully read them, while in his mind, he was surprised to realize how long it had been since he last took up a weapon. The title of the Heavenly Sword had long openly confused him, but then the silence was broken by a single fresh rumor. The man jerked away from the pile of papers and abruptly stopped reading the news that his grandfather had suddenly taken a student knocked him off track. The sect leader leisurely glanced over the lines of the letter. Mu-ak never intended to take students. The old man stubbornly refused to share his combat experience, further refused to protect his followers from the very torment he had already endured himself. After your words, a smile lit up the reader's face, so someone had indeed managed to touch this stubborn oddball. The message mentioned a strange boy with completely covered Danthian marks. And yet the young man incredibly managed to maintain absolute natural harmony with the surrounding world. The leader blinked in confusion as he finished reading the lines. The audacious boy rejected the offer and directly said no to Mu-ak himself. The old man noted that he decided to stay there for some time and ordered himself not to touch or disturb anyone. The man snorted softly and, stretching out the words, muttered aloud the name of the Sanghamun sect and the name of that elder brother Li Hwi. Mu-ak didn't even waste time. He invited him over as soon as he stepped down from his leader's duties to taste the local dishes. He leaned back in his chair and laughed loudly and sincerely. Far away from here. In the gloomy room, the candle flame flickered weakly, and someone's words tried to figure out why the old monster settled in Sanghamun. All the threads gathered again in one place, the sword piercing through the clouds and the same mysterious Li Hwi. From the darkness emerged an icy gaze from beneath a horned red mask. A brief pause hung over the stage. The man in the demonic mask thoughtfully tilted his head and wondered if all this was really just a coincidence. Irritated, as if warning, his fingers rattled on the table. This stranger suddenly became a real obstacle to their plan. In the darkness, a voice sounded with one question: what to do next? In the conversation, they mentioned the infamous phantom blade of the massacre. Now he rots in their dungeon. A cold spark flashed in the leader's gaze. He snarled fiercely, confidently reading in it that the captive's uncontrolled rage would do all the dirty work for them. The short command released the monster tore the silence to shreds. While the silence lasted, the warm sun softly lit the peaceful mountain estate. The black-haired warrior greedily chewed rice, loudly triumphing over every piece of delicacies. The gray-haired elder squinted with pleasure over the cup and was convinced the cook's confidence was completely justified. He, without even thinking, sharply asked for another portion of food. The boy smiled warmly and reached out his hand for the empty bowl. The old man fixed his gaze unblinkingly on the youth's back, and his sincere impression was felt in every pause in those hidden abilities. The ordinary food on the table seemed to radiate a gentle, life-giving light, shimmering with inner strength. For a moment silence fell. The master squinted sharply. The young man did all this unconsciously, but according to Taoist laws, the centers of power work quite differently. The lower danshan sinks its roots into the earth, nourishing it. The middle part purified the air, and the upper connected the person with the sky. A message appeared in the guild center about the next trials and new rival team. The old man slowly and intently shifted his gaze to Li Hwi. The young man smiled warmly, holding a bowl in his palms, but none of his three centers began to open. He only extended his hand with rice, and the guest instantly felt absolute harmony with the world connect with this movement. It broke all the usual rules, and suddenly the master was struck with surprise as a tense foreign gaze interrupted his reaction. Two children, pressed against the table, stared at him warily and gloomily. The boy jumped up sharply and with a full mouth shouted, "I will bite the old man if he tries to take our older brother." Noise rose at the table. The students pressured the mentor and argued that without the older brother the school faced a hungry death. The boy abruptly stood up and cut off the conversation. He said he was not going anywhere. Little Hohen blinked embarrassedly, pressing a portion of greens to her hands. Brother released energy and the bowl with the hot dish flew straight and smoothly to her. Thick steam covered the table with a solid veil. The little one joyfully waved her arms, begging for a little more. But still, in a moment, brother turned stern and pounced on another student because she left food on her plate. He cut off Tangoyuli's excuses with a sharp, cold tone and immediately ordered, "Eat the vegetables." He swallowed nervously and rushed with a quick offer to bring the mentor tea to ease the atmosphere. The young man smiled widely and sincerely at the master. The gray-haired guest sat opposite silently chewing, and in his mind he only wondered, this boy, it seems, has completely erased his own past. Suddenly his news shattered the family idyll. Soon the head of the Changhian family would visit them along with his children. The young man closed his eyelids and barely audibly asked again. With a light, carefree smile, the young man announced that guests from the Changhian family were coming, and with this one message the mentor felt as if the ground was literally pulled out from under his feet. The old man was pierced by cold sweat, and his face twisted. True fear distorted his features. With a rumble having swept his palm across the table, he desperately burst out shouting, "And what do you want from me? What am I supposed to do?" The gray-haired elder exhaled heavily and sighed deeply. Next to him, a young man smiled and stared with a question, wondering if it was time to pay for the tasty food, and this almost drove the interlocutor to a white heat. The head of the Changhian family approached the gate with the children, and immediately the boy accused the old man of a cunning miscalculation. He squinted with pleasure, as if he had caught the right mood. The young man's predatory, audacious smile completely unsettled the man. He had never encountered such impudence before. The elder's threatening order to drop everything immediately and leave crumbled against an indifferent phrase that was taken as, "Let him go." In a moment, the boy solemnly folded his hands in greeting. With a perfectly sincere smile, he greeted the head of Changhian on behalf of his mentor. The elder respectfully raised his hand to the guests in the same way, and immediately words of approval flowed from him for his strong, reliable appearance. The leader nodded and allowed himself to go inside, but inside him buzzed a hidden curiosity about the manners of this eccentric boy. While this moment lasted, the young man, without unnecessary fuss, conveyed the master's apologies for his absence at the meeting. The whole group, having gathered together, set off through the spacious courtyard of the estate. The guest only good-naturedly burst out laughing and, waving his hand, dismissed the apology as complete nonsense. The guest with long gray hair politely apologized for his unexpected arrival. He loudly insisted that he only sought peace and intended to strengthen ties in Anson County. But his gaze sharply betrayed suspicion. The host's hidden intentions seemed too transparent to him, too obvious in advance. For now, two young men exchanged forced smiles and played out a feigned warm brotherly greeting. The boys reluctantly embraced each other, acting out a warm, brotherly greeting. Watching this, old Jinan barely restrained his anger and in his thoughts mercilessly cursed that shameless scoundrel. He was boiling with indignation. He was offered to pay for lessons with the most ordinary food. The Taoist crossed his arms over his chest and snapped. He would not fall for such tricks and would not conduct a single lesson. The dark-haired young man, holding a tray, only smiled gently and reservedly. Jinan angrily blurted out that he was terribly mistaken. This frivolous boy was no good person. A smile flew off the face and immediately faded. The young man spoke evenly and coldly, admitting that he indeed planned to lure some wisdom out of the master. At that sudden seriousness, the old man instinctively twitched all over. The boy calmly laid out the tea cups on the table and in an even tone said that no one was being pressured. He was only opening the door to choice. They slowly walked down the corridor. Jinan firmly held the tray with tea and, without looking away, listened to the elder who emphasized, "The verdict remains only with the young man." The gray-haired master watched the boy with his eyes and inside admitted, now he understood him even less. For now, a dispute flared up among the students. In Murim, they say, every other sect is nothing more than a rival to them. Someone sharply and indignantly addressed Jinan. Why on earth is he going out of his way and sharing his knowledge with outsiders? The young man froze at the threshold and in an even voice said that each of them needs to grow and then they will become stronger together. He sharply glanced over his shoulder and relaxed, smiling carefree. But this did not move the master in the slightest. He coldly and briefly snapped that their Sanghamun clan gains no benefit from such generosity. A heavy, drawn-out pause hung in the air. The old man's face froze like stone. As soon as Jinan spoke about the peace in Murim lasting too long, the master tensed sharply and immediately asked if the boy was contemplating a coup. The youth instantly dismissed his suspicions. He wants to defend this entire world. His mentor and his younger brothers and the old man immediately broke out in a cold sweat at such uncompromising words. The youth with the tray walked through the courtyard step by step and, addressing the senior master, insisted, every sect in the Ansan district must strengthen itself. The youth asserted that for this, every sect in the district must necessarily gain strength and fortify itself. He stayed behind and anxiously asked, "Is it true that a great calamity is rolling over Murim?" The boy nodded calmly. The signs are already approaching, and at that very moment cold sweat ran down the old man's face. The memory of a past life struck like a painful blow, a terrifying silhouette with burning eyes and the start of a great schism. It all started with a bloody armed clash between the Sevan clan and the Suwon estate. Hostility instantly engulfed the entire region. Only chaos shattered the balance in the Ansan district. Sevan fighters coldly sliced through the air, revealing their blades. They dismissed suspicions as a local quarrel, but other masters already saw the truth then. The clan was recruiting Ronin in whole batches and preparing their first strike. Turning back to the conversation, the old man said that clashes are an everyday thing, as always. But the young man instantly froze. Over the years of peace, the sects had managed to accumulate too much power. Gloomily staring, he said that now all this looks like petty incidents. Before him, hellish flames flared up again. It was in them that he once stood broken and helpless. He remembered too clearly what these seemingly petty things would turn into, so now he was desperately searching within himself for strength to cover and protect. His fingers clenched the edge of the wooden tray. With a crunch of force, what would happen next? The elder slowly ran his fingers through his gray beard and thoughtfully asked what they would do when Murim fell into chaos. The young man with the tray in his hand stood calmly and respectfully nearby, not saying a word while the mentor spoke. Later, he stealthily approached the half-open gate and peered into the courtyard. Two children, in despair and anger, shouted indignantly at the grandfather, accusing him of outright cheating. He easily tossed the ball up and swung it in the air, demonstrating the luxurious yudeng technique and boasting of his skill. One of the students twitched and sharply tried to snatch the toy, but the old man effortlessly knocked him down with his knee. The ball sharply flew upward. At that very moment, the grandfather momentarily lost vigilance, and the older brother immediately intercepted the prize. The boys dashed away with joyful shouts, catching each other up and shouting over one another as they ran. The old man got angry, furiously waving his fists, and rushed after the little troublemakers. The young man stared confusedly at this circus. He had confidently only aimed a pig's bladder at them so the children would quickly come closer. The mentor solemnly tossed the ball above his head, mockingly enjoying how the group of upset children stood humiliated. The boy twitched and nervously scratched the back of his head. A completely different picture was already forming in his mind, and reality did not match. And the old victor, without support, sank onto the grass, breathing deeply and painfully and muttering about aching pain in his bones. The young man laughed and handed a snow-white cloth to the exhausted mentor, then boldly joked whether he was too cheerful for a man who was already dying. The old man grumbled and snatched the towel, but the boy was only amused by this scene. Suddenly, a warm echo flared in memory, friends laughing loudly on the clearing and carefully sticking together. The young man glanced over his shoulder and stretched his lips into a sly smile, and the master silently acknowledged he knows how. When asked about his plans, he disdainfully waved off and said that after everything he would just rest and savor life, and this confused the interlocutor. The boy sincerely could not figure out what to do after their victory, other than to eat and have fun. The old man fixed his gaze on that bright, frank smile and loudly, sharply scolded the cheeky brat, but inside he admitted to himself he could not understand what was wrong with that boy. Suddenly the master sharply stood up, and the young man involuntarily flinched. It sounded so unexpected to him. The old man fixed his heavy gaze on the student and slowly said, "He does not look like an outstanding intellect at all. And nature, it seems, did not endow him with any fighting talent at all. Intuition also did not justify expectations." The young man froze with a completely indifferent expression on his face, while the mentor called him a very strange boy. Silence covered the grass between them with a solid veil. The gray-haired man sharply leaned over the young man and sternly, without hesitation, ordered him to speak. "Who are you, if you speak honestly?" The question was sharply thrown, but the boy answered with a calm, impassive smile. The young man suddenly froze, and behind his back in a cold blue glow appeared a ghostly silhouette drawn from the past. The air twitched from a foreign dark aura and a sharp, chopped question, "Who is he really?" The gray-mustached master pierced him with a heavy gaze, as if grilling him on the spot. The boy barely stretched his lips into a smile. The tension snapped. The young man squinted with a cheerful slyness, while the elder laughed loudly and called him a cunning boy, not sparing his laughter. Two warriors stood unhurriedly in a forest clearing, holding the fight in a silent pause and completely stopping it. The master calmly looked away and admitted he had not felt such momentum from the very beginning, since the introduction to the Yuden sect. The boy silently nodded, without any unnecessary words. These words awakened a memory. Little Mu Ak sits in the hall opposite the yin-yang symbol, and from the very first day receives power from the elder. The frightened child froze, fixating his gaze on what was ahead. Suddenly, the imposed duty pressed on him as if he were crushed under the combined pressure of the entire sect. The young man compared his current fate in his mind with that confused boy. Silhouettes of former comrades flashed in his mind, memories of times when he bore the burden of the first disciple and elder brother of the school. With bitterness in his smile, he glanced over his shoulder, and the memory of how this responsibility once weighed on him in a past life flared up in his mind. The young man frankly admitted he used the guest's visit to pull the children into the sect. The old master silently watched this conversation, but he did not flare up with anger. On the contrary, he laughed and friendly patted the young man on the shoulder. From the very beginning, he had seen through this trick. The old man was already satisfied with the fact that the boy was not interested at all, whether he would take up teaching the little ones. The tension finally released, and the young man opened a smile with sincere gratitude. The group moved toward the estate, and around them rolled light children's laughter and carefree noise. The master smiled warmly and looked at the local children with frank surprise. A riot was already raging in the hall. A tiny girl hissed threats that she would bite the burly warrior if he tried to take their older brother. During the noisy dinner, the children shamelessly attacked the old man, accused him of cheating, contemptuously dismissing his status and authority as if they did not care. This childlike sincerity noticeably refreshed his mood. Under the sun, he squinted with satisfaction and eagerly began to ask what game they would play next. The wind sharply twisted the fallen leaves into a whirlwind. While the commotion continued, rumors were already spreading near the Songru pavilion. Some mysterious boy had refused Mu Aku Jinin himself for the sake of some uncle. The man was cold and sternly silent, not uttering a single word. Fingers were warming near a cup of hot tea. The exquisite beauty opposite slyly smiled and said that he should be completely satisfied. The man, instead of joy, exhaled heavily through his chest. The woman could not understand where he got so much depression from, despite the victory over the greatest Mu Ak Jin. Lowering his eyes, he gloomily admitted, not sure that this will turn out for the better. She asked confusedly what exactly he meant by that. The warrior's face darkened with anxiety. His hand was wrapped in crimson energy. The woman immediately understood that the reason was his unstable combat techniques. This destructive force was capable of wiping everything around to the ground. Or he is panically afraid of death, that the young apprentice will follow his dark path and eventually become just like him. He bitterly agreed with both options, but the beauty just laughed and bluntly said that this old man is a fool. His apprentice is nowhere near as the public gossips. The man suddenly shuddered, and the tension instantly melted without a trace. He heard that the boy had already grown into a real man, and with relief bowed his head low, thanking Lady Reggie. Then she finally said that the apprentice must be shown respect, and as soon as this flew from her words, the warrior abruptly cut off the conversation and seized the main question: why she had even called him today. A woman with a barely audible tapping placed a black cup on the table and immediately suggested getting down to business. She majestically leaned back in the chair and, pronouncing the name, clearly stated, "Go him the phantom blade of slaughter." As soon as the head of the Champion sect was mentioned, the man's gaze immediately sharpened like a blade. At one time, he personally wiped out this dark faction, but the leader then managed to slip away. The memory of the former enemy painfully pierced his nerves. Suddenly, a blackened red aura of rage burst from his body like a whirlwind. A harsh scream exploded in his head, "Drink to the bottom, scum," while at the same time the woman, without any agitation, dryly reported that she had finally caught the fugitive's trail. Around him, right in the center of the room, darkness thickened and fiercely swirled as if attacking from all sides. The interlocutor did not even flinch an eyelid. She only calmly and evenly poured him some tea. He took a sip through the swirling aura and muttered hoarsely that he was counting precisely on her. The woman sharply waved off the thanks and said that this was her usual job. Then, barely smiling, she said that he had changed incredibly. His new students had taught him simple emotions. The aura completely disappeared, and the man met her question without a word: what he would do if the rumors turned out to be true. The woman smiled quietly without any hurry. Suddenly, panic gripped her. The thought that he might have survived knocked the ground out from under her feet. A heavy blood-red aura with one blow pressed someone into the floor. While she was examining that flash of rage, she couldn't shake the feeling that just a moment ago he was sitting calmly and seemingly not moving at all. From the darkness came a cold verdict: you will have to kill with your own hands. For now, the evening city streets are calmly cut through by a crowd quietly strolling. In some dive bar, a quarrel was already brewing. Curses erupted over the table, followed by broken dishes. The mercenaries sprang from their places, boiling with indignation. They were being forced into the role of executors, and someone was trying to command them. The trio laughed brazenly, forcing the interlocutor to shut up and just keep drinking. The white-haired swordsman barely turned his head and nodded indifferently. This rabble could never compare to his subordinates. His own people have long been dead. He grinned horribly and stated outright that he had personally sent them to the other world. Drunken laughter was cut off by a sharp jolt of silence. Clutching a bottle of sake, the white-haired man threw a wild glance at them and cut off. From now on, they would unconditionally obey everything he commanded. The dark-haired man hesitantly fell silent, embarrassedly hesitating, as if admitting that it might be true. Suddenly, he was interrupted, and the end of that phrase was already cut off. From the darkness, a red eye flashed fiercely, and maliciously the stranger cut off his own phrases, saying that what was said was too complicated for them and would not be understood. The trio sat at the table, shuddered from their own tension, and nervously coughed, while they were persistently poked with a reminder, a proverb about the one whose enemies are her enemies. The gray-haired man, clutching a jug, grimly grinned and mockingly threw, as if he had no expectations of loyalty from such scum. He indifferently placed a bare foot directly on the severed head and cut off an order to be silent and do everything they were told. Calling them worthless creatures, the gray-haired man sharply turned away and threw the mercenaries into a state of stunned, deaf silence. His bare feet squelched wetly as they stepped through puddles of blood. The footsteps abruptly stopped. The gray predator only stretched his lips into a smile and declared, "Survival at any cost is necessary for only one reason." He fixed his gaze on the hall where mutilated bodies lay. To continue enduring these pitiful spectacles, 6 guards in black armor lined up in a tight row, closely locking their shoulders, and pointed their spears forward. One of them stepped forward and sharply ordered the bloodthirsty killer to demand a stop, surrender. The stranger opposite responded angrily, "He hates these slow government lackeys." The gray-haired man with a predatory smile raised a black pill to his lips and offered it to the enemies, suggesting they take the medicine. In the background, 3 of his fighters crushed and swallowed others like themselves with a loud crunch. While the guards shouted, ordering to drop weapons, the gray-haired man held his sword so tightly that the hilt literally could not be torn from his hands. He sharply threw his head back and burst into wild laughter, releasing thick black smoke from his mouth. His hand tensed to the very edge, and veins spread under the skin in a coarse network. The man, enveloped in a sinister aura, staggered forward and firmly said, "This drug is true madness." A bloody darkness suddenly covered the space, as if tearing the light from reality. His gaze was overshadowed by complete darkness, and a wheeze burst from his chest. He promised that these bastards would understand everything very soon. The frenzied accomplices, with eyes flashing like predators, sprang from their places and rushed into attack. Sally checked the allies' strength and ordered not to waste the last items unnecessarily. A scarred face, drenched in blood, stretched into a terrifying smile. The phantom blade of slaughter proclaimed its return. The bloody glow was cut off by the instant strike of the title inscription. Meanwhile, in the dark room, the children snored carelessly in their sleep. The young man barely opened the door and cautiously stepped outside. Step by step, he walked through the yard and replayed the thought in his head. Pointless fuss would give them no chance to lay a solid foundation of martial arts. Before his eyes, a daytime game of ball flashed. In the heat of the competition, the little ones fussed endlessly, as if burned, paying no attention to their own fatigue. Stopping in the shade of the trees, the young man suddenly realized he could pass off exhausting training as ordinary fun without unnecessary noise. He fixed his gaze on the bright, full moon and, as if aiming, calculated where it was best to start. Suddenly, he slowly and thoughtfully ran his fingers over his chin. Behind the massive gates there was silence, but the mentor for some reason did not come out for an unjustifiably long time. A girl stood nearby, almost ready to cry along with the puppy, and trembled with anxiety. Had they caused trouble with the teacher on the way? The young man blinked confusedly once again and, picking his words a little awkwardly, said that she was really very worried about the master's fate. The boy stepped closer, and anxiety for the mentor froze in his eyes, but the old man only burst out laughing in response and again threw out a fishing line about apprenticeship. The words hung in the very air. The gray-haired man intently bit into the face of the interlocutor with his gaze. He did not even blink, sharply rejected the offer, making it clear that he had already refused once. The old man stared confusedly and shouted angrily, insanely jealous of that scoundrel. The boy flashed a warm smile. He respected his master not out of empty duty or dry rules. Even without any martial arts lessons, he would remain just as devoted to him. When it dawned on him, the old man's eyes suddenly widened. The boy recognized in the mentor a true, native family. The elder, catching with his eyes this unconditional devotion, realized the entire Songamun clan depends on this young man, so he decided to lure him even more strongly to his side. He trampled on any dignity and switched to funny, pleading intonations, assuring that the boy would not even have to start training. Suddenly, the elder's voice became sharper. He remembered the Yuden sect. "Silence!" Finally, he said directly, "Because of such stubbornness, the younger disciples will hate him again." The boy defiantly raised a finger, and the mustached old man, looking increasingly irritated, angrily scolded him for his unbearable stubbornness. The old man finally gave up, waved his palm, and sent the young man to meet the mentor. The heavy door creaked and barely opened. The teacher stood at the threshold, sharply said that he was delayed, while behind him the old man grumbled discontentedly. With a dry farewell, the mustached man sharply turned around and quickly disappeared from sight. Everything froze in silence. The night sky was covered with twinkling cold stars scattered like a continuous spark. In the dark courtyard they moved slowly, step by step, and the master in a steady tone sent the apprentice to rest and go to sleep. The young man suddenly felt the air tense and fixed his gaze intently on the man. A shadow covered the mentor's face. He quietly asked for permission to pose a question. The man approached the apprentice again and without any detours asked directly, "Does he regret his choice?" The boy suddenly froze, confused and completely unprepared for the feelings of such anxiety. Fixing his gaze on the master's shining back, he suddenly sank into memories of his former life and was struck by the realization he never managed to learn a single word about the person who had never once asked him any questions. The bearded warrior calmly fixed his gaze on the future and evenly, without hesitation, declared that he did not regret his choice. The young man clenched his jaw and grimly cut off that he too had no regrets. The former place no longer mattered to him. There was neither mentor nor brothers there anymore. He barely stretched his lips into a smile and, looking directly into the confused interlocutor's eyes, admitted, "This is now his true sect and his native home." The boy openly spread his arms to the sides against the backdrop of the night courtyard and sincerely asked him not to drive him away. A brief silence hung in the air. The elder warrior shifted his gaze without a word. The bearded man's gaze slid over the majestic buildings of Sanghamun. He confidently confirmed that this was their shared home, then suddenly became embarrassed and quietly apologized for his excessive reaction. The boy quickly closed his eyelids and gently assured that everything was already fine. The tension finally subsided, and they stood calmly side by side in the night courtyard. The man sharply stared at the sky and warned, soon he would have to leave for some time, so it made no sense to wait for him any longer. Both froze in place and stared into the boundless bright starry speck scattered in the darkness. In the night silence, a short but iron promise was made to definitely return home. While the pause at the tea table lasted, a surprised voice suddenly flared. "For the first time, Mek Sanan came here personally." The gray old man suddenly froze, holding the cup near his lips, and tensely, without any circumlocutions, directly asked what brought the warrior to him. In the dim room in the thick darkness near the tea table sat two people. Sanan slowly poured tea, asking his interlocutor to look after his students for the next few days. The elder grimly squinted. The request sounded completely inappropriate from the mouth of the person who not long ago had turned a sword against his own senior student. With a dull thud, the kettle heavily landed on the table. Sanan began a conversation about the one who remained alive, about the leader of the dark sect he destroyed. His gaze became significantly more serious. The target was the Phantom Blade of Slaughter, a bloodthirsty maniac, whose terror was felt even by other dark sects. Last time this monster escaped from captivity, but now rumors are spreading through the city about its return. The elder abruptly cut off his own story. He directly asked the question, would Sanan be able to handle such an opponent alone, since the swordsman himself keenly senses the limits of his own body? The old man heavily closed his eyes. Sanan remained completely calm, until his figure was uncontrollably enveloped by a terrifying bloody aura. The body was about to completely fail. The elder folded his hands on his chest and stubbornly hinted to Sanan, the sword. He best senses the limits of his own body. Sanan froze in a trance, and a thick crimson halo covered him in waves. The merciless verdict had already been passed. The body was about to break. The elder shuddered from tension and whispered a question. Was the truth already known to Li Hwi? Sanan painfully exhaled, as if suffering had torn from his chest. The mentor pressed inquisitively. Could it be that he has to carry this burden all alone? The warrior said evenly that his health would collapse as the price for a wrong choice, and vowed to endure until his very last breath. The elder wearily ran his palm over his forehead. Sanan's path had nothing demonic about it. In memories, suddenly a gloomy silhouette of a warrior surfaced, standing among the slain enemies, neither the path of evil nor the path of the righteous. The elder pressed his palms heavily on the table, finally accepting this bitter truth as a verdict. Sanan fixed his gaze on his eyes and said dryly, if he continues training, he will simply die. The gaze slid over the empty shelves of the quiet room. The old man desperately grabbed his head, while the doomed swordsman remained sitting motionless in the half-darkness. Thus began the story of the great elder brother Li Ho. The quiet evening was suddenly shattered by a child's scream. One of the adults burst out in indignation over an unfair game. A quarrel broke out again in the yard. A noisy trio from the Changhan family argued with the elder, giving no one peace. The youngest fiercely waved his fists and shouted that using movement techniques was unfair, and his sister loudly supported him with words. The space tore apart with a sudden jerk. A man with an oily shadow rushed through the yard, barely missing other students. He cold-bloodedly pressed the little ones with words. If they don't like something, let them take on the techniques themselves. The angry girl snapped at him with an insult, called him a scoundrel, and the boy in despair retorted, saying they haven't even managed to learn this yet. The elder snorted condescendingly, saying those who stall always lack excuses, and then the boy fearfully stumbled, not hearing his own words. Two young men aside twitched confusedly, as if caught off guard. A lightning-fast step kicked up a cloud of dust. The boy immediately spun like in a dizzying whirlwind, on the spot. The students began to look around frantically, and the target finally slipped out of their sight. But in a moment, a strong palm grabbed the boy's head. He kicked his legs in the air and screamed wildly that he was treacherously attacked without warning. Someone laughed loudly, and now it was up to the Kot Kakan to lead the tag. The old man, joking, grabbed the displeased Kachan by the collar and pulled him up, while others urged him with joyful shouts, "Run!" Muak sharply turned away, pressing his lips and barely restrained laughter while those childish complaints rained down on the mischievous old man. The boy instantly wiped the insult from his head, sharply took a funny stance and burst out shouting, now he would definitely catch everyone. From the side, it seemed as if perfect Muak was truly born with the skill to carefully care for little ones. At that very moment, a bell rang from the yard, and a sweets merchant approached the gate. The children froze in place, tightly clenching their fists in delight. Muak smiled softly. The merchant had long since become indistinguishable. Memories spun him back in time to where he was also holding the hand of a child who incessantly begged for candies. Songamaniu was just missing the one whose sleep had just been allowed to come off pause. His younger brother from a past life, the fifth student he had ever seen, who bitterly cried in his arms. Back then, the sect barely stayed afloat without money, and he could not get even something for the little one, but from now on everything would change. The young man's gaze hardened into unwavering determination. He made a firm promise to change his fate, while the joyful children rushed to the gate, even if some of them grumbled about the tasteless sweets of this merchant. The students crouched tightly in a group behind the wall and peeked outside, whispering to avoid losing their appetite for the local hearty dinner. The boy angrily crossed his arms over his chest and muttered that it was not at all necessary to rely only on sweets. Suddenly someone sharply called him by name. The stocky mentor, sword at his belt, confidently walked down the stairs. He gave a warning. He needed to be away for a few days. The boy stayed close and asked again if this was the planned trip. The master waved it off and ordered not to worry. The man smiled softly but confidently and loudly, clearly promised he would definitely return. Soon his broad back disappeared beyond the gates. The student silently watched him with his eyes, and the thought spun in his head. The mentor was far from disappearing on the road for the first time. But right now the heart suddenly trembled with anxiety. He convulsively pulled his shirt on his chest, trying to suppress the sudden, evil premonition that surged with anxiety. 3 exhausting long days passed after the master's departure. At the Sangamun school, the usual routine did not move an inch. From early morning, he had to scrub the floor and wring out heavy laundry. Having finished the housework during the day, he entertained the children from the Changhan family. As soon as they turned away, Tangoyul and Chkhwa instantly lost their strength right in the middle of the Manhwa art practice. Hohin was already dozing off while the evening meal was ongoing, so only the deep night time remained for his training. He closed his eyelids and tried to gather himself, tuning in. A sharp jerk. Lifted by a blue aura, the young man rushed forward with lightning speed. Such a movement failed, and he got stuck in the grass with heavy braking. In irritation, he grabbed his head and conspired with himself. Something around was distracting him all the time. Obsessive thoughts would not let go and did not allow him to fully concentrate. He slowly raised his eyes to the night branches. In his past life, the mentor never set out on any road until the end of spring came. An anxious question instantly clenched his face with a cramp of tension. Why exactly? He slowly ran his hand over his chin and thoughtfully softened his gaze, trying to understand what exactly had crossed out the usual chronology. The young man stared into the night sky and tried to understand whether his actions had shifted the future, but a sudden loud shout abruptly interrupted his thoughts. He sharply turned to the perfect Muak and he immediately realized the boy was once again tormenting himself over the mentor. The young man nervously blurted out his worries, and the elder only burst out laughing in response. Does he really think the teacher would occasionally pinch him on the sides? A heavy silence hung over the night courtyard, and Muak cut the anxiety at the root and advised not to torment himself in vain. But as soon as the cloud lifted from his eyes, the boy's face suddenly darkened, and he immediately asked bluntly what the elder had recently whispered about one-on-one with the mentor. Muak gently stroked his beard and calmly replied, the teacher only asked to watch over them because all the students were still too inexperienced. The boy slowly lowered his gaze and clearly, without self-deception, admitted all his own shortcomings. He firmly grasped the sword and clenched it with a single thought, to become at least a little stronger, so as never to become a burden in a real fight again. Muak advised him to stop gnawing at himself and focus on honing his skills, and the boy quietly nodded, accepting the words without argument. The elder stood silently nearby. The young man raised his gaze and now, without hesitation, agreed with the guest. From now on, his main task was reduced to continuous work on himself. A firmness flashed in his gaze. From now on, he would give his all in training. He clenched his fist tightly and declared firmly, he had no doubts about his own diligence. The gray mustachioed man swayed to the side and with a barely audible HMPH, spread a smile. The boy turned out to be unexpectedly simple and straightforward. Although he was not his mentor, he could still oversee the training. The young man nervously sweated at this promise, not understanding where to hide from his excitement. A brief moment of silence. The old man's face sharply sharpened and became stern. The air suddenly twitched with a heavy wave as soon as the command sounded to show all their strength. The elder shrugged his shoulders, put his hands behind his back, and indulgently said, although he was not this young man's mentor, he could quite well take charge of his training. The master's gaze pressed with weight and at the same time remained coldly calm. He sharply gave the boy an order to demonstrate what he was really capable of. While he twirled his mustache, the old man said, how many warriors they would have killed if they had acted on my advice, and these words confused the student. He blinked in bewilderment. The master coldly cut in. He did not look like a joker at all. And in a moment he darted into a scream, demanding, stop staring and start because he needs to get some sleep. The young man caught the moment and, focusing on the thought that the vigilant watch of the perfect Mu Aka is his chance for luck, instantly gathered himself. He desperately needed to grow at least a little, just a bit, to become stronger. The lad closed his eyelids and exhaled long and loudly. He completely immersed himself in the feeling of the ground beneath his own feet. Blue energy instantly tore the space apart with a shockwave, and small stones flew up around in a flash. He sharply felt the earth slipping right from under his feet, and with a blue flash he swiftly tore forward. The young man closed his eyes and concentrated the blue energy tightly gathered around him. With a sharp exhale, he lunged forward in one jerk. The gray-haired mentor silently studied each of his movements, as if dissecting him into components. The body lost balance, every movement became sluggish and clumsy. Another attempt ended in a fall. He was struggling and slowly getting up after another failure. The boy understood if he repeated it again and again, eventually he would definitely find the right answer. I don't see the original line that needs to be rewritten. Please insert the specific text of the line, one line, and I will do a deep cinematic rewrite without changing the meaning. No one even thought about stopping. Time relentlessly rolled forward, not stopping for a moment. Somewhere high in the mountains above the mansion's roofs, only heavy, tired breathing was heard. The young man was drenched in sweat and, barely standing on his feet, trembled from exhaustion. Exhausted, he bowed his head guiltily before his mentor. The master only briefly froze in surprise. After all, he was the one who gave the order to go out for training, so any excuses here simply made no sense. The teacher's voice tore through the silence like a verdict. The boy has not a drop of talent. A heavy fan with a loud crackling fell on his head. The young man gritted his teeth from the bitter, offensive truth, and at that moment the old man threw out, he has one special gift. Steps disappeared into silence, and the mentor sharply asked if the apprentice was ready to find his own answer. The boy froze confusedly, not taking his eyes off what was happening behind his back. The master sharply outlined that he needed exactly observation and imagination. A short pause. The teacher stared sharply straight into his eyes. Master this and then you will get the dreamt of. The apprentice thoughtfully ran his fingers over his chin while tangled explanatory words swirled around the thought. To feel a true connection, first you need to discern the essence. Or vice versa, to analyze everything so that no hints or unity are needed. A soft glow suddenly enveloped the youth's silhouette. The energy of acceptance and fusion pierced his body with a continuous flow. He first focused on the command, to look, and only then to imagine, and with all his might pushed into the attack. When the final instruction sounded, the blade of the sword blinded with a flash. Turn your own imagination into the voice of the weapon. The youth sighed heavily. These talks about spiritual connection sounded like bizarre Zen riddles, but he still felt deep down how they harbored a hidden weight. The old master smiled warmly, then briefly called the apprentice to go to sleep. The two unhurriedly headed straight to the dark mansion. Far, far away, the night sky was covered by cold clouds, tightly blocking the stars. The wind ominously scattered black shadows in the darkness, as if someone was pushing them into the gloom. At this time, the bearded lone warrior was making his way along the forest path, a bag hanging from his shoulder, his steps stretching out in the silence. Suddenly he froze in place. The man tensed sharply and raised his eyes into the dark, impenetrable thicket, as if something dangerous was hiding there. From the darkness emerged a pale, bald old man nearby. Behind his back, murderers were crowding, and he greeted Sanan's sword ominously. Sanan immediately recognized these faces. They were hunted by the remnants of the dark art sect. He slowly lowered the load to the ground, harshly scolding himself in his mind for once missing the moment and letting these rats escape. The swordsman sharply said. He himself admitted that he acted recklessly and carelessly. In the darkness of the forest, an entire squad stumbled upon him, but the hero had only one thought spinning in his head: where is the phantom blade of slaughter now? The bald leader burst into laughter and with disgusted contempt declared that the swordsman had been bathing in luxury all this time. While the enemy showered him with insults, he only raised his weapon at him and coldly, clearly voiced his question once again. Enraged by this contempt, the bald man snatched a black pill and fiercely ordered his men to do the same immediately. The crack of a broken outer shell. The enemy's hand was torn apart moment by a terrifying wave of dark energy, and the swordsman immediately recognized a flash of dark arts in it. The bald body twitched and pulsed horribly from the excess of power, and the hero, without unnecessary emotions, threw his last warning in response. The mutant blade responded only with a furious roar. The enemy choked on hysteria, wildly shouting about the swordsman's obsession, and the swordsman, sighing deeply, dared to force the truth out by force. The air was cut by a bloody black flash. The blades collided head-on, and sparks flew at the strike. But the hero's power broke the resistance. With one sharp swing of his hand, he threw the monster far back. Borodin froze as if he had been switched off, and cold sweat covered him. He could not comprehend where this terrifying power came from. The bald opponent crookedly stretched a smile through a purple aura and threw a question. Does he not want to find out where the phantom blade is hidden? Mockingly, he whispered, the blade is already there in the place that frightens the great sword of Sanan the most. No, Sanan instantly turned pale, covered with a terrible realization. A powerful wave of dark energy instantly knocked the swordsman off his feet, and the enemy with sardonic self-satisfaction boldly praised his guess. Sanan instantly rushed forward and managed to intercept the moment. With a sharp counter-strike, he deeply cut the bald man's chest. But instead of a cry of pain, only a furious laugh burst out. An old scroll landed on the table with a dull thud. The mistress of Raju, like the undead, stared with an empty gaze at the hieroglyphs and bitterly reproached herself for her blindness. The puzzle came together. The brazen massacre of government troops in Baekju County turned out to be a bloody show, staged only to attract attention. The appearance of the killer in another city at the very moment the uncle left no coincidence. She was pierced through by icy fear. She had personally given the enemy a chance and, having arranged everything, lured the uncle out of Sangamun. A terrible realization was abruptly interrupted by the scream of a frightened subordinate. She rushed in and collapsed into the room. The girl in the blue cloak suddenly froze, and cold sweat ran down her face. The ragged and exhausted Lady Raju, gasping for breath, exhaled the terrible news. The phantom blade of the slaughter charged at Sangamun. At that moment her last strength vanished, the woman sank helplessly, and the girl sharply lunged forward to catch her in time. Raju convulsively gulped air, pressing her trembling fingers to her forehead. In her memories, the insane grimace of the gray-haired maniac was cut off a blazing eye, and he admitted with obvious pleasure, it happened because of him. His gigantic bloodied hand irreversibly loomed over the peaceful estate. Darkness covered Sangamun.